performative absurdities of academia to an extremely hilarious extent, I think, when ethnicity did not matter in the Balkans. We Westerners, we are so much better because we have now ideologies which we use to justify killing each other. I think all religions are syncretistic. For modernity to emerge, you would need three main ingredients. One being where you got your degree doesn't really matter if you have a good quality product. Taxes in the late 17th century in southern Bohemia. I could go on for hours about this. I call it the lost art of writing postcards. Because the single biggest military defeat German armies ever suffered was in 1944 in summer. So the family legend has it that he never went into any body of water further than his waistline after World War II. Own your own land, grow your own food, have a gun. Why on God's green earth would we consider the language people speak the only thing that is both unchangeable and the only thing that defines your identity? How do you think this crisis kind of like spiraled completely out of control? Because it was holiday season. Hide behind your titles, you're doing something wrong. Sure. So thank you very much for your kind invitation. My name is Stefan Fares. I'm a historian of European history. I work mainly on what happened after the Middle Ages. I was born in Vienna, Austria. I also got a degree from the University of Vienna. I have a bunch of other degrees from other places. You can also feel free to kind of like visit my faculty profile. I'm currently, since 2020, employed as a tenured associate level professor of history here at the Department of, and now I'm going to rattle off our joint colleagues here, archaeology, history, cultural studies and religion at the University of Bergen in Norway. We are at 61 degrees north, 61 degrees north. So long summer evenings, very long winter nights.
Okay, just a geographical thing here. I'm in Connecticut, in New England, and we have a similar climate to like northern Scotland, but latitude-wise, we're equal with Portugal. I'm not a climatologist. I don't know how that stuff works, but we get cold, not as cold as you, but we get cold. But we don't get as much of the long summers, short winters that you would get in like Alaska or in Norway.
We had a colleague over from the university. So what was this? The University of Washington in Seattle in spring.
My family lives there. My sister lives there.
I was totally mistaken, not thinking about what you just said about latitude. And I'm like, oh, it must be a little bit like here where you live. And he goes like, no, where I am right now. Norway, think like Alaska. We don't get as much cold where I am. For that, you'd have to go further inland and further north still. But in terms of like sheer geographical location, so Connecticut, Portugal, Norway, Alaska.
Unfortunately, we don't get the northern lights, but we still get the cold. Again, not as cold as you, I think. Our climate's probably similar to like Denmark. But regardless, actually, I don't know where Bergen is on the map.
It's in a place in a province called Vestland, so which just means it's the westernmost county, and it's pretty much close to the part where Norway kind of like budges into like the North Sea.
Yes, yeah. I was actually supposed to go there, and I got very, very sick. I was supposed to go there with, there's another YouTuber, Nordhuger, who he's an American. In America, there's like different, like the white people in different places of America are descended from different places. So where I'm from in New England, it used to be all English. Now it's mostly Irish and Italian. I'm mostly Irish. But he's from the Midwest. He's from Minnesota, where it's all Scandinavians and some Germans, but Scandinavians. Yeah. He works with a lot of guys out there. So I was supposed to go out there with him, and I got very, very sick. Okay. Your name's Stephan.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, we would say Stephen here, which is
feel free.
No. I cultural anthropology is my thing. So even with these weird Native American names, I try my best. Stefan I can do. Stefan's not entirely foreign to me. So you're Austrian?
That's my country of origin, and it's my citizenship.
It's your citizen. And Norway is not
in the EU.
They're in NATO, but they're not in the EU.
They're also part of what's called the EEC, the European Economic Core. What is combinate cooperation economic zone or something.
Right. What currency do they use in Norway? Because I've been to Denmark and Sweden, but I haven't
Yeah.
been to Norway, and I really want to go. I especially for the nature there and the architecture. But
You should actually. So Norway uses Norwegian crowns.
Oh, okay,
It's a very funny currency. Funny in a way, the same like So the Danish crown, they are in NATO plus in the EU, but they kept some exemptions from like the Eurozone. But the Danish crown is pegged to the euro. The Swedish crown is, I believe, it's technically floating, but I think it's kind of implicitly pegged to the Danish crown, and the Norwegian crown is not. Yeah, I mean, the Danes and the Swedes also have their own central banks, but the Danish and the Swedish economies and their currencies are much closer interconnected with the EU, obviously. And the Norwegians, they seem to believe that they are kind of like a little bit more special-y.
At the point that your economies are so interconnected, it's almost irrelevant if it's officially pegged or not, I think.
Yeah, especially because the central bank is typically intervening if the crown goes too far in their perception either way. So it's technically, I guess, a moot point.
Isn't it the kroner in Sweden? Kroner? Okay, cool. But kroner just means crown, I guess. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Just one more thing about if you ever make it to like the part of Norway where I am, and Norway, don't forget it, Norway is huge in terms of like, size relative to population. If you ever make it here, since you mentioned the Midwest and the, let's say, functional origins of many of the Americans who live there, we do have a very large community of like people whose relatives have emigrated to the US. There's even like, it's about an hour north from Bergen where I'm sitting. There is a West Norwegian emigration center where they have put like a very small, quote unquote, Midwestern town replica thing up there. It's very cute. So, I mean, we once visited, it's like an open air museum.
That's
so they have
cool.
like, so it's an open air museum. So you have like a drugstore, a couple of houses. There's even like, quote unquote, a typical wooden church there too, etc. So there's a lot of like connections, and every now and then you meet like lots of Americans who go back visiting relatives, and even like, so I typically live, so technically I live a little bit outside in the countryside in a small town, and even there is now at the supermarket, local grocery store, there is an American woman married to a Norwegian.
Oh, that's
like,
very nice.
Can't escape it, so to speak. But it's a funny thing because a lot of Norwegians have ties, and since you're interested in anthropology, I recently read a very interesting ethnographic study. It's by E.A. Ross. It was printed, I think, 1913 or 14, and the title would be The Old World in the New. And it's got chapters, and there, of course, value judgments. Think about it pre-World War One in terms of like, which are the best immigrants. So on top of that list would be like the Scandinavians, because they're Protestants, they know to behave in public, they quickly learn English, high literacy rates. Second most favored immigration group would be the German speakers, because they're also very orderly, they know how to brew beer, and they're also very good at speaking English and integrating. And then it goes all the way down, and once you go to like, Southern Italy or Eastern Europe, the value judgments become a little bit different.
Right, of course they do. I can imagine in 1913 that was the time when my family came here. I'm 3/4 Irish. My mom is full Irish. My dad is half Irish, half Hungarian. I'm aware of the issues. I also, America is it's a Protestant country. I don't know why they started letting Catholics in, and I say that as a Catholic. Do you do anything with naval history?
So far, not really. I mean, so I come from a landlocked small country, Austria.
Right.
And
yes.
So my connection to kind of like try to segue a little bit into like the topics you wanted to talk about. So I did my first book project, which came out of my PhD, about 16th century, the Republic of Venice in what is today Croatia, used to be part of Venice for centuries, from the early 15th century onwards. And I mean, this is one of the things, I'm not giving like, advice as in like, try to get a PhD in history here. So I'm not saying that. But with that being said, the thing that I always say is find something that, like, an area to study, doesn't matter which subject, by the way, could be anthropology, could be, geography, could be, economics, where you think like this is a place where I would like to go on vacation as well. And if the food is also good, that's like a win-win situation. So
Yeah.
the city I was spending some time in, Zadar, in Italian, that would be Zara, is a very nice place. It's like a couple of 100,000 inhabitants. It's situated right at the Adriatic coast. So it's a really nice Mediterranean coastal city. So this is my tendentious connection to anything related to naval history.
But the reason I brought up naval stuff is Sweden, which of course is not Norway, but Sweden has the Vasa Museum, which is the most incredible, breathtaking thing that I've ever seen. It's my favorite museum I've ever been to in the entire world. Where I'm sure you're familiar with it, but for the people who don't, there was a 17th century flagship, King Gustav something. He commissioned this ship, and for some reason, it was built too low to the water, and they set the ship out on its maiden voyage, and it sunk right there in the harbor. But what's good is that for preservation of shipwrecks, it's great for us, bad for them. But of course, like over 100 people died. It's very sad, but it happened in the 17th century. At this point, whatever. The water in this harbor, because it's outside of Stockholm, is brackish, right? And salt water is much worse for preservation of shipwrecks, and also cold water is better for preservation. So it's the best preserved 17th century ship ever found. And fortunately, the descendant of the guy who actually commissioned the ship, who was the king, was an archaeologist by training, and it was like one of, if not the largest archaeology projects in history. They went and they pulled the ship out, and just how they did it is insane. Oh yeah,
Can I
go
just
ahead,
add
please.
something about the ships? Because while we were talking, I was like, it's one of the things that I can speak a little bit about in terms of like holiday destinations if you're into like naval history things. For reasons that were connected with the relocation to Norway in summer 2020, we did a little road trip to Oslo, because most people don't know this, but if you move from one country to the next and need new passports or documents from the embassy, from the consular section, first time you ever need them, you need to actually show up in person so that they can actually make sure that you are who you are.
That makes
And
sense.
Austria, being a very small country, doesn't have like the US, like consulates all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
So we took a trip so we have two daughters. They're like,
so you had to go to Oslo from Bergen.
I was there. We were in the country for like 3 months or something. It was the autumn break, so we did a road trip, and going across like the Hardanger, it's like a high alpine. It's like the southernmost reaches of Arctic climate on the continent.
Oh, okay.
Driving across this in early October, the views are spectacular.
I'm sure.
So we had an appointment at the consulate. This was within it was still 2020, so COVID mandate madness and stuff like this. But we did get into a couple of like museums. So the Viking ship museum in Oslo was closed because of a strike. So we went to the Fram Museum, which is they built in the 30s. They built like a museum around the two ships with which the Arctic explorers from Norway actually went to the North Pole.
Oh, wow.
And this is so cool because you can like climb up there, get in there. And Norway is like a maritime country, so you get a lot of like these maritime history things. And the other thing I'd mention is like if you're into Vikings, who wouldn't, to be honest?
Right, of course,
Who of course wouldn't? Is it the better place to go for Vikings apart from Oslo, because they're currently rebuilding and expanding the Viking ship museum in Oslo. It's going to open. It's probably cost overruns and opens with delays, as these things always do. So in Denmark, you can, which is not that far away, so there is Haithabu, there's Roskilde. And the latter place, Roskilde, I happened to visit this summer. And I mean, they do have a bunch of like Viking ships that they've excavated from like the seafloor. The other thing that I would mention is, to go back to like my research history and stuff like this, the Republic of Venice. And since you mentioned this wonderful anecdote about the Vasa ship, so the Venetians, they used galleys.
Right,
either
of
like
course, the Mediterranean Sea. Yeah.
triremes or biremes. And the difference between bi and triremes, of course, is like the amount of oarsmen who would, power the oars. So trireme
Right.
means like 3 men per oar, bireme means 2 men per oar.
Right. Slaves.
So
But yeah.
not all. So this
Oh,
is
not
also
always.
tricky. Not always. So historically, this is like, the free citizens would kind of like be in wartime be conscripted.
Oh,
But
okay.
if it's not wartime, they could like be contracted. So
Oh,
you take out a contract, so you become like an oarsman. There would also be other people aboard these ships, like, a ship's carpenter if something needs fixing, etc. Cooks, soldiers, of course, would also be there. But Venice is famous for 2 things in regards to like maritime history. One is like this overseas, I hate to call it empire. I prefer to use the term Commonwealth for a very specific reason. Venice was a republican city-state.
right.
And yes, it had control over certain areas. What is today is like Cyprus, Crete, and Greece as well, and a bunch of other places.
Yes.
But it was not like, a monarchy ruling over, distant imperial colonies. It's very different in terms of like structure from, say, Charles V's, Latin American colonies.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And so the Venetians, they would over time, as the fleets, as the ships grew bigger and the fleets grew larger in size, number of vessels, they would need more manpower. So over time, this occurs roughly around the 16th century. They would shift from freemen being conscripted to do like military service in the Navy. They would shift to increasingly use convicts as oarsmen, as well as slaves.
Yeah.
In this, by the way, the Christian sea powers were all the same. So the papacy, the Pope's fleet would do the same. The Spaniards would do the same. The French would do the same. This was one of the harshest like punishment that you could get for like treason and other things. You would be sentenced to galley service.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. And the Ottomans as well.
Of course, they did the same.
The Ottomans, I think they started the slaving prior to the 16th century. I think that was that was a long-standing thing.
Slavery is like it's almost like in anthropological terms, I would say, like it's almost like a universal constant. There is only one civilization that, for moral reasons, sought to outlaw it, and that is Europeans around 1800. So
right.
we'll just have to be perfectly clear about this, and the moral reasons they do this is because the guy's name is Wilberforce. He was a very devout evangelical Christian who believed that this was morally wrong.
The other thing, whenever we talk about the end of slavery, what I like to bring up is essentially, in my understanding, correct me if you have anything here, but this is getting into early modern, but when the British Empire ended slavery, they enforced their ending of slavery in a lot of ways. They used in practical terms, they ended slavery in the sense that there were slave kingdoms on like the coast of Africa, and they used it as a casus belli, as a reason for war, for those listening, if you don't know, to invade and conquer these slave kingdoms that they had contributed through incentives to creating and expanding. People don't like colonialism; they don't like slavery, but the end of slavery contributes to the expansion of colonialism in the 19th century. There's always somebody being oppressed, essentially, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the things, we touched on this prior to starting the recording, but one of the curious things about academia is the selective reception, or if you want to be less charitable, it's the memory holding, all the literature. A dear colleague, he by the name of Mark Crispin Miller, he teaches at NYU, got into some serious trouble at the beginning of COVID with asking his students, and he was teaching a course on propaganda, asking his students to actually read the studies about I think it was about face masks. But this is not what I don't want to go down that road. But the reason I mention this is because Mark also started out as an early modernist, in all honesty, and then he at some point in his life shifted into propaganda studies. And the funny thing is that he has something he calls the forbidden bookshelf, which is one of the coolest things you'll find on the internet, because he's republishing some of those books that have been more or less consciously memory holed.
Yeah, there's a lot of them.
There's a lot of them, and the funny thing is, since we're talking slavery, to reconnect it a bit, you would see and I'm going back to the Mediterranean in the 16th century in a second, but what you will see quite clearly is like, the Danes were actually outlawing the transport of slaves a couple of years before the British in 1807 did this.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I mean, this is something that almost nobody knows about, because it's also not like, oh, this is unequivocally good, because that didn't mean that you couldn't buy slaves that were transported, say, on non-Danish ships.
Ah, okay.
You see, there's a lot of things, and if you change something that is so, let's say, universally widespread and diffused like slavery, and I hate to use the Americanized version of this institution, but it was a core institution.
Mm-hmm.
Throughout human history, every society had slaves. But if you take out that, it's almost like with this Jenga tower thing. If you take out like one of the foundational bricks, at some point, the whole thing becomes very wobbly. And then you would have to consider what's the intended as well as unintended consequences. You could make, basically, this is tangential, but you can make essentially the same argument about it was the British who forbade in India the burning of widows, which I think everyone should probably have no problems agreeing it's not a good idea to burn a widow. I mean,
I'm down with it. Yeah, hot take. I don't agree with burning women alive when their husbands die. That's crazy.
But of course, this creates a lot of downstream issues, because this is a massive infraction on like how traditional societies, if you want to call it that way. I know it's probably a problematic term, blah, blah, blah. But I mean, let's call a spade a spade.
Yeah,
but
you don't have to worry about being problematic here, man. I promise you, it's okay.
If we go back to like, say, the 16th century Mediterranean, not only you would find a lot of, let's say, hybridity, but you would also find not only that, say, the Islamic sea powers would do essentially the same thing. There's even like exceptionally awesome literature that has sadly never been translated from French into, say, English, for instance, by Benassar. It's called Les Chrétiens d'Allah. It's the Allah's Christian. Because, of course, if you get captured, and this is basically, you can read a fictionalized account by somebody who knew Cervantes, Don Quixote. He was one of those people. And there is an episode in this 17th century novel, which I can only recommend. It's a hilarious read. But there is an episode where he recounts, the fictional protagonist recounts like an episode about being a galley slave in Algiers.
Oh, gosh.
And he knew this because Don Cervantes, the author of the novel, that is very autobiographical. To try to bring this all together, the funny thing about it is not the hilariously funny style Cervantes wrote about this, but imagine you are like a coastal shepherd or like a peasant, and there comes like a couple of like raiders and you get abducted. So instead of like being a peasant in a more or less oppressive feudal European territory, you're now like a galley slave. So how do you get out of...
Worse. It's not good to be a serf, but it's worse to be a galley slave, I would say.
Yeah, but there are, of course, shades of differences. So one of the core ways how you could weasel your way into like a slightly elevated position would be to convert to Islam. This is why Benassar wrote about Allah's Christians.
Mm-hmm.
And this is also something that is partially recounted by Cervantes in Don Quixote. And then if you follow that trajectory, you are like on a galley, then you enter into like, huge sea battles or what have you, or you you get like liberated by your fellow Christians.
Right.
So they see you dressed in like traditional Muslim garb, and they say like, oh, come on, you filthy, infidel heretic, blah, blah, blah. And then you say like, look, I'm not Mohammed bin whatever, but my real name is Francis. I was actually born in this part of like the Kingdom of Spain. I just pretended to be a Muslim. And if you did this, then you get hauled before the Inquisition. And they will then come up with like, they will ask you, interrogate you, let all your Monty Python-esque associations about the Spanish Inquisition run wild now to figure out how these things work. And there are tons of like archival records about those interrogations where you have like those poor people asked like, oh, did you really mean it when you converted to Islam, or did you just do it to have an easier life there? So it's a lot of those things, but this is wartime. In peacetime, in the Mediterranean, wherever you go, and if you are into archaeology/anthropology, one of the coolest places to go to is Sicily and Sardinia in Italy. They have Sicily is one of my favorite places to go. It's one of the most amazing places to go. Not in summer because it's extremely hot.
Oh yeah, I'm
But
sure.
but in terms of like Sardinia, they have like megalithic structures that they can't explain. Yeah, but as you can see, I mean, most of those islands and the coastal communities, they would build like watchtowers, like you perhaps if you've watched the movies, the Lord of the Ring movies,
Hmm.
where they light the fires on top of the mountains to indicate this is now the Allies are coming or what
Right.
have you. Or
Gondor calls for aid, and
exactly,
Rohan will answer.
they would have the same structure. So this is kind of like, because Tolkien was a keen scholar of medieval Europe. The Irish had these large towers,
Hmm.
for instance, that you can still see all over Ireland at the coast. They would have this as watchtowers and as places of refuge for the local peasant population. So this is like something that is very Mediterranean and
Hmm.
very much also connected to like, is there a heightened, let's say, risk of raiders coming across? If you go to especially the Spanish and the southern Italian coast, if you look at, and you can do this on like Google Maps, if you go to those bigger cities and look at the old towns, they look like a maze because they intentionally built like cul-de-sacs and like those weird ways where you don't really find your way out if you don't know where you are, just to
Right.
confuse like the incoming raiding parties.
Yes, and I'm sure that mattered for the Reconquista as well. You know, that there was 400, 500 years of that.
Let's just one more time go back to Venice because I got kind of like distracted about like the naval things. So
That's
the
all right. This is
Venetians
all about.
have a very cool thing. It's called the Arsenal, the Arsenale di Venezia. It's like this gigantic shipyards, state-owned shipyards
Oh,
from
okay.
the 16th, 17th century. If you read like the literature, so there is an American scholar who's done a lot of research in the 70s, 60s, 70s, early 80s, Frederick Lane, about the shipbuilders. So you can basically kind of imagine Bethlehem Steelworks and industrial action of quote unquote, contract labor when they are pissed off about labor conditions. So you have this like wherever you have those kinds of like quote unquote economies of scale going on, even though they would, of course, everything was made by hand and it's like they try to mass produce.
Right.
But one of the perks of being somebody working on Venetian history, widely understood, is at some point I was actually able, during like a workshop visit or whatever, to actually be able to access the Arsenale in Venice, which is
Mm.
technically still restricted military area.
Oh,
Italian
okay.
Navy owns it. They rent out like part of the like peripheral like halls. They rent out. They use it every 2 years for the Venice Art Festival, the Biennale. But they also have like a very nice naval museum. So as I mentioned, the Venetians in the 16th century, they used galleys. But you reach a certain limit of size, which is determined by building out of wood, but also in terms of like, with galleys, they are special because they can't really go across the open ocean.
Right.
With
Yeah.
like, I don't know, 300 oarsmen, you would go and find a harbor every evening to replenish water, food supplies, etc. Also because, they don't go very deep into the water, they are not really able to go across the ocean.
Right.
So in the 16th century, you have a lot of like northwestern Europeans coming with their sail ships into the Mediterranean, like the Dutch, the English, the French. So they gradually take over because their operating costs are kind of like much lower because the cargo bays are larger. They don't need the huge crew,
Hmm.
and they can go across the open ocean, and they don't require. And this is the key to understanding the Venetian Republic, by extension also the other Italian maritime republics of the Middle Ages. They would seek to have fortified outposts so that we can call on a safe harbor at night.
Right.
So this explains how they go to like the Levant and do business there. And the
Yeah.
Venetians at some point, because it's a lagoon where Venice is, which is not very deep, they tried to build sail ships. But because the water is so shallow,
Hmm.
there's this wonderful anecdote. So in the 17th century, the Venetians built one of those sail ships, but because the ship was too high, like with all the masts and everything, it
Yeah.
simply just fell over because
Oh.
it wasn't stable enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And they had no tradition with that. I'm sure they were probably importing English or some sort of Northern European, Dutch
It,
or Scandinavian shipbuilders to do that, right?
yeah, that you have, but the Venetians couldn't really use that kind of like technology because the Venetian lagoon is too shallow. So you
Right.
can't actually go in there. And if you would now go to like Google Maps and look at the Venetian lagoon, you can see that they dug up like canals into the lagoon so that those big bloody cruise ships that vomit out like
Oh,
thousands
yeah.
of tourists like every time. Like,
The worst.
but
The worst
they
type of
can actually,
tourism.
but this is how they actually managed to get those huge ships into because the lagoon's too
Right.
shallow. The weird thing is it also destroys like, the city of Venice. It has about like 50, 60,000 inhabitants. And I don't know if you've ever been to Venice.
No, I've never been to
But
Italy.
oh, you need to go. Venice is one of the most magical and saddest places you can ever go. But if you ever go there, so no, because it's like in summer it's totally swarmed with tourists.
Right. I was
But
looking at something about this recently, actually, about tourism in Venice. Tourism in general, but it included a big part on Venice, and
yeah,
it was
and
sad, very sad.
it's look, it's a blessing and a curse because if you have like individual tourists who would kind of like rent like a hotel room for a night or two, and they would go to like the most important sites, museums, churches, etc. That's one thing. But if you have like cruise ships that vomit out like thousands of people, if you want to sit like in St. Mark's Square, have a cup of coffee, pay like $20 for a cup of coffee,
Exactly.
and you go like, they don't spend that much money. I know this because in the small town where I live, so this year, because I'm like in the summer months, I'm helping out my neighbor who is like part-time farmer and is also staffing the local tourism agency. We had like 50,000 cruise passengers, and the small town has between mid-May and late September, by the way, and the town has like 2,200 inhabitants. So just to put this into
Wow.
perspective, so this is like
Yeah.
insanity writ large
Yeah.
in relation to the local population. But why would the municipality do this? Because the money they make is not. This is like the difference between the local government and the people, and they must not necessarily correlate very well if they go together at all, because the municipality would say like, sure, your cruise ships, they can come because they charge a harbor fee.
Massive
They
harbor
don't
fee.
they don't care whatever happens afterwards. And those people, most cruise ships, they have like all-inclusive food.
Exactly.
Some would even have all-inclusive booze if
Right.
you're into that kind of stuff.
Right. I'm not, but yeah, some people are. I think
Not
cruise
not
passengers
me,
generally are.
not
Yeah.
me either. But it's like, and if you think about it, so you go into a place where it's very pricey, like Venice. Then you have like 7 hours to walk around, and since I'm doing like walking tours and stuff like this, so I get to talk with like, because each of the groups that they come out, they have to book it in advance. You have like a kind of like minder or chaperone, and so I talk to them, and they say like, oh, we just have, whatever we do, we just have to be back by like 3:30 because then there is free coffee break and cookies or something aboard
Oh,
the ship. So
come
it's like,
on, man.
no, it's look, I would never do that kind of like vacationing, but it's
Right.
like, if you follow through that logic, it's like, what would these people do? They don't want to pay extra because such cruise trips are very expensive.
Right. They're already very expensive.
So they don't really pay like, and I've seen this like going to Italy or to any other Mediterranean country where you think like, most of the archaeological sites which I typically go to, and museums and churches and those kind of like things that I'm interested in, they charge you because it's like heavily subsidized, state run, etc. They charge you like $2-3 in
Yeah.
entrance. Some of the more high profile museums, such as the coolest thing in terms of archaeology I've ever been to, is in Naples in Italy, because they have all the cool stuff from Pompeii.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That'd be awesome to go to.
So they would charge you more because they know this is why a lot of tourists would come. But in general, I mean, you could probably kind of like get into like some pretty cool ancient Greek archaeological excavations for like $2. And then
Wow.
then you stand there, you pay your €2 coins or €5 or what have you, and you see like other tourists that don't care that much, or they come with a cruise ship and they go like, yeah, that's a little pricey, isn't it? And you go like,
Oh, no.
oh, come on, you just, paid like thousands of dollars or euros or what have you to simply get there. The only reason to get into this specific, godforsaken place is said excavation. And now you say you don't want to pay like $5.
The types of people who that would appeal to, I don't want to be too, rude to them, but I feel like the majority of, especially if someone listening to this has done one of those, not all of them, but in general, the people who that would appeal to would not be the types who would want to actually go to the archaeological sites.
Yeah, there's a corollary there. I mean, this is also like contemporary stuff. So Norway, for instance, has this long tradition of having like cruise tours being offered, going from Oslo to Trondheim with the medieval cathedral, and then going to the North Cape. So this is fairly traditional kind of delights or whatever you want to call it.
That makes sense to me. That makes sense to me to travel on the water because you'd actually see things there. I've been on a cruise, and one of them was in Alaska that I went with my dad, and that was it's similar to the coast of Norway, the geography. That was beautiful. That was absolutely beautiful.
I'll just enter this here. This is absolutely off topic here, but the place where I live in winter, if it snows a lot, it takes a couple of hours or days to dig up the road. So sometimes I have to take a speedboat, which is like a 4-hour cruise through the fjords. So it's like quote unquote the worst kind of like commute you can imagine in terms of scenery. No, but in Norway it makes sense in a different way. So Norway, if you ever go to Norway, I mean everything's ridiculously expensive, but it's also like I'm like in January, I'm turning like 44, but this is how I imagine driving in the 60s and 70s must have been. There is so little heavy traffic. There's also no motorways, and if you want to just drive and just look outside, speed limit outside the city limits is typically like 55 miles or something. So it's rather convenient, and often you can't really drive that fast because the road's too like narrow, too many bends and what have you. But there's another reason why I mentioned this, and this is like waterborne transport is simply so much cheaper. So it's the reason why you don't need that many trucks on the road is because it's literally the last mile that's done with trucking, because everything else is like shipped in on container ships.
Right, and that's way cheaper, way more.
Oh, way cheaper. Maurice Aymar has done some wonderful studies about 16th century like bulk good shipping, like grain in the Adriatic in the Venetian context. And he came up with a price differential of the factor of 7 between overland versus like sea waterborne transport being like a seventh of the costs.
I believe that. I mean, a crew of like 17 can ship like 100 truckloads or more. It's insane.
Yeah. So also because Norway is so big and the population is concentrated in a couple of like large towns along the coast, it makes sense also in that kind of like context to kind of like go. They called in Oslo in winter, so everybody was kind of like rolling out like the red carpets. They were putting out like outdoor dining areas for all the American sailors. But if you imagine, they have like those huge ships, they don't come alone, so you would have kind of like the same effect in terms of like thousands of people being like quote unquote vomited out like within like if they go on shore leave. So it's like, it's like 4 p.m. be back by like 2 a.m.
Yes.
Don't get into any troubles, people, and they will have fun. Look,
somebody's
I'm not
gonna get in trouble.
Yeah, but I mean, I'm not judging this. I mean, but in terms of like it has the same effect, I think, in terms of like where you have this mass influence of people, but I think with like sailors on shore leave, you would actually get a little bit more money spending going on than with the average
definitely.
tourist.
So I was in the U.S. Marine Corps and I deployed on a naval ship. You're definitely going to get more money from them, and one of the big reasons for that is that with a cruise ship, people are on a 7-day whatever, give or take, they're on a 7-day cruise, maybe more, maybe a little less, and they've spent their money on a naval ship. They're being paid the whole time they're out there. And unless they have a terrible wife who's spending all their money, they're stacking up their money. And then maybe for a month or more, they're stuck on the ship, unable to spend money besides in a vending machine that's on the ship. And then they get dropped somewhere that most of the Americans on that ship would never be able to go to otherwise.
No.
Right. So they're, I deployed on a naval ship, but I was in they wanted to bomb Muslims, so we were mostly in the Middle East. still went to some cool places and spent a lot of money. But with the newer ships, I think the aircraft carrier, the newest one, I looked it up, is the Gerald Ford, he was the president right before Reagan. And what they'll do with the newer ships is, if you're on a new ship, that's the best place to be, because the U.S. Navy wants to show off their new ship. So if you're on the newer ship, you get to go to all the best port calls, because they'll bring that ship everywhere just to show it off. And then you get the benefit of that. I was not. I was on an old ship from 1992 was when my ship was made. And so we only got to go wherever was most convenient. No, not 1992, 1990.
No.
So I went to like Dubai, Bahrain, Jordan. I got to see Petra, which was amazing.
Oh, that's amazing.
It was gorgeous.
I've never
Jordan
been.
was incredible.
Must be like amazing.
It was surreal, absolutely surreal. But yeah, that was absolutely incredible. No, I'm sorry, it was commissioned in 1993. It was laid down in 1990.
These things are both extremely expensive, and they take an ever-increasing amount of time to actually put together before they are actually commissioned and ready for service. I'll just add one more snippet, because I would like, if that's okay, give a shout out to my PhD supervisor, Carl Kaser, who passed in a couple of days before Easter in 2022. He was a chair of Southeastern European Studies and Historical Anthropology at the University of Graz in Austria, where I got my PhD from. And I want to give a shout out to him, because I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for him. And the funny thing that connects it back to what we were talking about, sailors on shore leave. I was asked by his partner to contribute to a essay collection in his memory, and I said, I put everything aside. I said, of course I'll do it. I'll prioritize this, because this is important for me.
Right.
And within scholarship, it's kind of like those kind of quote unquote hobby horses to a certain extent. If it's for no other reason other than honoring a departed friend or something, they typically are supremely hard to do, because it costs money that you will never find funds for.
Right.
And people don't take it too seriously because it's not too scholarly.
Right.
So shout out to Michaela Wolf, who was Karl Kaser's partner for decades. She put this all through. It's 330 pages full of funny essays, thought pieces, anecdotes, etc. So it's not very scholarly, but she put this through in less than 1.5 years, from could you consider contributing to, here is the book. And the reason I mentioned this is to give a shout out to Michaela and to Carol, but also because I was asked to write about a couple of pieces Karl Kaser had written about doing field work in the Western Balkans in the early 1990s. So one of the pieces that he wrote was reflections on doing field work in the Albanian hinterlands in the early 1990s. And there is this one anecdote.
Dodging Serbians. Jesus.
No, it was no. This is early 1990s.
Oh, early 1990s.
Yeah. So this is
okay.
Albania had just opened up after its Maoist experiment.
Right.
And he recounts this anecdote, and this I think reflects to a certain extent the performative absurdities of academia to an extremely hilarious extent, I think. So he writes a lot about, the Western Balkans have this kind of very bad reputation, backward peoples, blah, blah, blah. I'm backward.
Yeah.
Which
Americans
is, of course,
know about it, they know that. Yeah.
So, a lot of it goes back to Maria Todorova's Imagining the Balkans book, which I personally appreciate because it's about the Balkans, but it's not a good book. So I'll just say this out loud.
Okay.
Better books you could read would be by John Fine, who used to teach, I think, at Ann Arbor, Michigan. He had so he wrote overviews over the early and late medieval Balkans. But the best book that he wrote was this synthesis called When Ethnicity Did Not Matter in the Balkans. Came out in 2007, if I'm not completely mistaken.
That sounds very interesting to me, as a place most known for their ethnic conflict.
Yeah, but it's you see, the funny thing about it is you go to pre-modern, as in let's say, American French Revolution times. So we're talking about like roughly the 1,000 years from the end of the Roman Empire around 500 AD to quote unquote like the beginnings of the modern age. So it's more than a millennium. You go there. How would people identify? Primarily, they identify with family. They identify with their neighbors, which is in like 90+% rural context would be a village community, and it is with their creed.
Right.
So if
this is
they talk
way pre nation state, way
yeah,
pre anything
but
like
there's
that.
there's a twist to this, because they would identify. I mean, you certainly know about like interconfessional violence known as the Reformations, etc. But the Reformations have always had this kind of like supremely twisted kind of like accounting, because it's on the one hand it's quote unquote religious wars, but on the other hand, in the absence of quote what we today understand to be like modern political ideologies and languages and concepts and terms to use, to say like, I don't agree with you because I'm in favor of, I'm now making up stuff like I'm like limited government, free market person. You are like a socialist, to use just the broadest possible labels. You could throw in fascists, what have you. It doesn't matter which one. But all of those terms come with certain quote unquote secularized or secular connotations. If you're like, say, a neoliberal or a classical liberal, if you're a fascist, if you're like, Republican, Democrat, what have you, you can kind of like deduce from those notions where this person stands on certain issues. In pre-modern, pre-revolutionary Europe, you wouldn't have that. So you would go for the next best thing, which is like, nation used to be like, where are you born, as in like, which language do you speak? And the other thing that they would use is like religion. So they would be using religious differences to make a political argument, essentially, which I think explains to a very large extent why you see a lot of like quote unquote religious violence. Because if you want to piss off your, let's say, Catholic king, and you want to lead a group of rebellious, borderline seditious nobles, the way you prove that point is not by saying, dear most gracious king, by the grace of God, I disagree with you, but you change religion, and then you say, I disagree with you because you believe the wrong thing. So it's a political argument couched in religious terminology.
Right. Absolutely.
And in this regard, this is I think what underwrites a lot of these troubles, and I think it's a crucial failure of a lot of people, especially like in the social sciences, to they fail to understand I mean, if you talk about like I'm not an expert by any stretch of the imagination of the contemporary Middle East, but you always hear these kinds of like, oh, these are just like crazy Muslims, they like to slaughter each other for like nothing better than religious things, and we Westerners, we are so much better because we have now ideologies which we use to justify killing each other, which is
not true.
Bottom line, like if you look at the end result, there's not that much of a difference other than like the virtue signaling value judgment. Like, we are better because we don't use religion to kill each other. I'm not sure that's a winning argument, but
No,
I'm
not
also
to me.
not one of those who would say like, look at what they do. The Iranians, the Sunni Shia divide also is indicative also of a quote unquote, if you want to call like the differences like genetically, ethnically, linguistically, culturally between say Arabs in what is today Saudi Arabia versus Persians who like to be called Iranians in present day Iran. If you want to look at that through like, sure, you can say this is like a religious conflict reminiscent of the age of the Reformations 500 years ago in Europe, and what you're implying is like, it's like a kids' table argument, as in like, oh, we're so much better because we did this 500 years ago.
Exactly.
So it's not a good argument.
No, it's not at all. It's complete BS. And of course, like if you go down to the root of it, the creation of Shia Islam. I mean, you can get into the theological argument of the differences between Sunnis and Shias, but ultimately, I think it has a lot more to do with the Iranians, the Persians. Obviously, Iran has other minority groups, but mostly Persian. They adopt Shia Islam as a response to its growing strength, and they add in their own culture into the DNA, the metaphorical DNA of their religion that they're doing. Like Zoroastrianism survives within Shia Islam practiced in Iran. And this is something you see elsewhere as well. There's an example. I was researching Francis Drake, who's one of my favorite historical figures, and Francis Drake's early life was tumultuous based on ethnic conflict, or not ethnic conflict, but ethnic conflict that was undertoned by religious conflict between Catholics and Protestants. But the reason for that is that the Cornish, being Catholic, and the Catholic religion having preserved, and this is something that is explicitly explained in the primary sources from the 16th century in Cornwall, the Catholic religion had preserved Celtic traditions within it. And they were resisting Protestantism, not on even explicitly theological grounds, but on the grounds that their own culture was being preserved within Catholicism, and Protestantism being, more generalized, would destroy that. And he was not Cornish, but he was living in Cornwall at the time, and his father was Protestant, placed in that position. This is the early modern period. This is like, obviously you know this, but for the listeners, this was like, before the nation state. So this was at a time when there were still nobles being given land. So his father is given this tract of land in Cornwall. But when the tides change back towards Catholicism in the area, he had to flee. Him and his family had to flee. And it's because of that religious conflict, which is, it becomes religious, but at the same time, I love this. This is very cultural anthropology. At the same time, how we define religion is itself a social construction. And, there's hundreds of definitions you can find in anthropology and cultural anthropology, as well as in other fields. Eliade, there's plenty of them. But the distinction of what makes a religion is itself, how we think about it in the West, is based on our Abrahamic religions. It's based on Christianity, but broadly on Judaism and Islam as well. The definitions, they are insufficient to explain ideology, and at the end of the day, like all of these ideas, they're compartmentalized into what is a religious, what is an economic, what is an ethnic idea. But all of those are to a certain extent, they are real in the sense that there's real things behind them. Ethnicity is based on DNA, but it's really not. It's not entirely based on DNA. It's also based on how we think about what those differences are. And
I'm so glad you brought up the Cornish example, because I think the biggest takeaway for me from what you just said about this is, like, you mentioned that they would use Catholicism as the vehicle to preserve their pre-Catholic or pre-Christian culture and heritage. And I think this is the one way to think about the emergence of, say, the different branches of Islam in the Middle East as well. Because if you look at how, and this goes a little bit more to, what I professionally study in my academic work, like East Central Europe, etc. But I think this now applies to what you just said, because the way, say, Hungarian kingdom around the year 1000, or the Poles, or later the Baltic peoples, or even the Scandinavians for that matter, the way that they become part of what used to be called for centuries Christendom, but which is until around 1700 is the term by which Europeans primarily identified themselves. So yes, I'm French speaker, I'm a subject of the German king or the Polish king, what have you, but I'm a Christian first, so Christendom. But the way you can participate is by becoming Christian. So you have those events when Stefan, the king of Hungary, gets baptized. You have the same thing, by the way, 200 years earlier with the Danish warlord. I think the name is Harald Bluetooth, which, by the way, is why the Bluetooth logo has this rune-like appearance.
Yes.
But so they get baptized, and it takes ever, like centuries, to kind of like, percolate through all of society, to build up the infrastructure, train enough priests, and have like everything else in place. But the point is, you get to join the club.
Right.
But you join the club to preserve your identity as a quote unquote nation,
Right.
as a tribe, as like a community that is partially imagined, to use Benedict Anderson's term, but it's also partially a community that is deriving from kinship ties or any other kind of like thing, like we speak the same language or we do the same thing. So for the Iranians, to go back to this example that we talked about a couple of moments ago, to kind of like embrace a different version of Islam than, say, the expanding Arab empire or caliphate. I mean, they would do this out of, I would assume, like, even though I don't think that there have been comparative studies comparing how to become a Christian in the Middle Ages in Europe and how to become a Muslim in, like, this at roughly the same time or a couple of centuries earlier in the Islamic world, would be fascinating to do that. But I would assume, judging from, this kind of like anthropological angle that you brought up with Cornwall, to kind of like, they would do this to, on the one hand, play with the others in the same kind of like language, thereby using religion to make a cultural, civilizational, even like political point.
Exactly. And I think that is what happened in Iran, in Persia, because like it's that whole, if you can't beat them, join them thing, but then you get to join on your own terms and you get to set the rules
to a certain extent. Yeah.
And right. You can't do whatever you want. You're obviously joining the religion, but you can change it in the ways that, as much as you can. And they did this in response to Islam growing in strength within their own territory, and it seemed to have worked quite well for them. And a similar thing happened in Ireland as well, with another Celtic people versus the Cornish, and that has trickle down effects. Ireland was Catholic for 800 years, or it still mostly is. But that, like, as a kid, my mother would, there's a saint for everything, but a lot of those saints are their canonized versions of old Irish of old Irish gods and deities. So, like, as an American, obviously, I'm very American. I have Irish roots, but I'm third, fourth generation American, depending on which ancestor it is, and that's full American. It's like, I don't, like, my grandfather spoke Hungarian, but speaking English since then. So I'm very integrated, obviously, and but those Irish roots were still very much, and I didn't realize it, because to me, I was just listening to my mom talk about saints. I didn't understand at the time that this was a thousands of years history of these ancient Irish deities, and I don't even know if she knew. But I learned when I was older that yes, a lot of these are canonized versions of ancestral deities, which I think is just incredible.
I mean, to a certain extent, I think all religions are syncretistic, but
I say that. Oh my God, I love that you said that. I say that exact phrase. People have definitely listening to this have heard me say that, and I love that you said it first.
And what I would also say is, I'll just add this because that I have inherited my late grandfather's vintage postcard collection, and that
we're going to talk about it. Yeah.
But I have to say this now because in terms of like, so a couple of weeks ago I did something about Ireland with posting some of the Irish postcards, and it was somewhere in the northwestern coast. There is St. Patrick's, Mount St. Patrick or something, where people would still kind of like, do like a pilgrimage uphill each year.
I've been invited by some Irish friends to go on some of these pilgrimages. I don't know if it was that one, but yeah.
And so I mean, I've looked it up because it was one of the motifs on those vintage postcards that I have in my possession. And I'm like, if you go, so there is like, for this pilgrimage, they have like Visit Ireland, there is a dedicated website, what have you. They say it's like 40,000 pilgrims each year in summer, etc. But they also say like this is the Christianized version of like a pre-Christian, pilgrimage site. So it's
Wow.
exactly what you mean. And I mean, I come from a Catholic background in Central Europe.
Austria. Yeah.
And the funny thing about this is, of course, they come with like local varieties.
Right. Much more so than Protestantism, which of course has its own, but it seems
but
like
you
it's
see,
a bigger.
Protestantism is one of those weird things. It's a catch-all thing that works as long as you don't need to have a conversation about it.
Right.
Because traditionally, Western scholars would kind of like point to, say, the Lutheran Reformation as kicking off the renovation and splitting of the Western Church, but I mean, this has a long tradition. If you go back to like the middle of the 19th century, Leopold von Ranke, the German professor who's kind of like treated like the founder of the discipline of history or something, he famously wrote in his History of the Reformation in Germany, he wrote like, I'm paraphrasing this from memory, so please don't cite me on this one, but he famously claimed that for modernity to emerge, you would need three main ingredients. One being movable type printing, the second being Protestantism, and the third being gunpowder. Adding, of course, because he was a good Prussian, well, two of those three just happened to be invented by Germans, which is, of course, to put it mildly, BS, because yes, there were people who spoke German 500, 600 years ago, but to call them like Germans with the 19th century modernizing mindset in mind is just hilariously anachronistic. But the problem there is, while this view has come under increasing scrutiny and has been kind of like relegated to the proverbial dustbin of history after especially the Second World War, 1450, give or take, with the invention of movable type printing, as well as like 1517, Lutheranism, etc.
I should say, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but it's my opinion, and that the movable type, I'm sorry, who was the guy in Gutenberg, right?
Yeah.
I very much believe that he got that from China. He never claimed himself to have invented it. It was invented in China. I believe that came on the Silk Road, and he obviously altered it, right? Because it's different. But I do think that was a lot of that technology was from China. But sorry, continue.
The difference being the Chinese used wooden blocks, and what the European. But I think that was also. I mean, I don't know much, if anything, about what they did in China a couple of centuries earlier. I wouldn't rule it out that there was some kind of like knowledge transfer. But if you look at the movable type printing that was invented in Europe, you would have to add two or three things where you say like, typically if quote unquote the time is ripe, you would see that advances or discoveries are typically made at roughly the same time in roughly the same area. And you can see this clearly. So there were predecessors in like what is today the Netherlands, I believe, if I remember correctly, a couple of years before that. But the main advantage of Gutenberg and the area where he invented this is important because this is the Rhine-Main-Neckar area where you have a lot of like waterborne transport. If you've ever been to the area, you with your military background, you may have actually been to Germany, to that part, because there's a lot of like
I've been to Hungary
bases.
and Austria, but not Germany.
No, because there's a lot of like military bases of the United States there, because it's the
it's all army though. I was the Marine Corps.
Used to be like the occupation zone after World War II. But the reason why I point this out is like waterborne transport. You would have a large number of towns and cities with privileges of like market privileges, minting privileges. You would also have like
expansion of the Free State,
lots of schools. So you would have a kind of like customer base for stuff like books. But you would also have like, this is an ancient wine growing region. So if you think about movable type printing using a modified press for making grape juice and or wine. So this is like this is the thing that you wouldn't have in a way like in the Netherlands, for instance, because of the low-lying soil, which is often very salty, so you can't do agriculture, which is, by the way, why in early modern paintings of the Dutch landscape, you see a lot of like, dikes with green grass and cattle and sheep on it. Because you
they could
couldn't grow,
graze but not plant
yeah,
crops.
you can't grow corn there because the soil's too salty. You can't grow like
Oh,
grapes there because it's
okay.
too salty, especially if it's below sea level. But Gutenberg in this area, so he had like the printing press was there. The demand from like bookshop for books would be there because there's lots of cities which typically have like even like rich, wealthy commercial centers, where you have also schools and where you have a lot of people with disposable income. And then
Right.
he also was a quite brilliant inventor because movable
Oh, he
type printing
right.
doesn't only require like the press and like the craftsmanship, etc., but you need to cast the letters, you need
Hmm.
to invent ink, you need to have a supply of paper,
Right. Right.
uh, you need to have new trades like book binding, typesetters. You need to have a distribution network, and this is important because I mentioned the Main-Rhine-Neckar like area. It's all connected by rivers, and the Frankfurt Book Fair is still there. It's the oldest book fair in Germany. It's the largest in Germany, and it
Oh,
sits
wow.
right around the corner from Mainz, where Gutenberg is said to have invented the movable type printing. So
Right. And Mainz was a free city under the Holy Roman Empire, right?
it
Am I
was, I think it was one of the seats of like one of the ecclesiastical electors. So it
okay?
was like you had like one of the, let's say, cabinet officials of the Holy Roman Empire
Oh, you're
voting for
right. It
it.
was an electorate. Okay.
Yeah. No,
Misheard.
but you would have a lot of those things. You would have like the pre-existing knowledge of like pressing because it's an ancient wine growing region. You would
Right.
have like the distribution network with like river transport. You would have the book fair, which was an annual fair. There you had like Frankfurt was also the city where the new emperor would be, crowned. So this
Oh,
is
I
like
didn't know
one
that.
of the in the early modern period, certainly. But so this is one of the larger centers of Germany. So if you imagine like you also for like something that is high priced, a new product, think like the iPhone. Where would you
Hmm.
sell this first? Of course, in New York and in downtown Los Angeles,
Right.
because
Right.
this is, and in the Silicon Valley, because this is where like people with a lot of money are.
It's the economic center of the time
So
and
you need
place.
to
Yeah.
have both the innovation as well as a customer base, and then you need
Right.
to
The
have like,
incentive structure to actually create it.
yeah,
Yeah. I mean, look, even if some of that technology was from China, that does not take away at all of the
no,
absolute
I didn't, I
genius.
don't mean to suggest it, but you
Oh, no,
see,
no,
if you
I
if you
suggested that. So I'm just making clear that he was definitely a
if
genius regardless and did
but if you go
invent
back, if
additions
you
to
now
that.
go back to like Ranke's arguments, you need like the Germans have invented Protestantism as well as like movable type printing, to two
Hmm.
core ingredients in his view of modernity. You'd say like you could buy the printing part, but now I have to talk or ask you: have you ever heard about the Hussites?
I've heard of the Hussites,
They are my
definitely.
they are my favorite Protestants to talk about, because the
Right,
Hussites, they take their name from a Bohemian preacher who preached in
right.
Czech by the name of Jan Hus,
Yes.
who
And this
lived in
was part of the
late,
Holy Roman Empire at the
yeah,
time.
but he lived in like the late 14th, early 15th century, and he was instrumental in like, so he came up with some ideas like having like electing your parishioners and your parish priests, like the community should elect them and not be appointed by Rome or
Hmm.
somebody else. He came up
It's a
with
very
this idea that
Protestant
you should
idea.
have like mass in your vernacular language. In his case, that would be Czech.
Also a
He
Protestant idea. Yeah.
well, he got the idea starting his kind of like proselytizing around like in the first decade of the 15th century, which precedes Luther by about a century, by the way.
Wow.
He started to have those ideas because he was a disciple to a certain extent of John Wycliffe, the infamous late medieval English proto-reformer, who was, I think he was executed in the 1370s or 80s or something.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I've never heard of this guy.
And so Wycliffism is part of like this late medieval disintegration of Christendom, when you have a lot of like quote unquote so-called heretics like the Cathars, the Albigensians in Western Europe are probably a little bit more might be a little bit more familiar with, but these are like, you know, people who are very unhappy with the way things are. Technically, like the mendicant friars, like the Franciscans and the Dominicans, they also come out of this kind of like, we need to renew the church spirit of the age, so to speak, in the High Middle Ages. And at the tail end of this like development, you see to a certain extent, like because the Cathars and the Albigensians in Western Europe, the Bogomils in Bosnia, they would be like a grassroots kind of like protest movement to a certain extent. And then with Wycliffe and Hus, you would have like highly trained, like quote unquote professors coming up with a new kind of like interpretation, which of course, to use a very technical term, pisses off the church authority.
Right.
But you have to understand back then, this is pre-Reformation, there's no need for the church to actually come up with like a catechism where it's clearly spelled out like letter by letter what Christendom, what Catholicism would be, because there's no alternative other than orthodoxy.
Right.
So Hus comes up with this idea, pisses off a lot of people in Bohemia, but also gets like a lot of like followers. So the emperor says like, we need to have a chat, let's have a talk, safe conduct, meet me at Lake Constance. At the same time, by the way, so a lot of Hus's friends said like, please don't go, you can't trust this guy.
Right.
Which was ultimately correct, because Hus was taken into custody and burnt at the stake in 1415 or something. 1415 it was, which kind of like triggered the rebellion in Bohemia, which was both on the one hand like a kind of like quote unquote national rebellion against foreign rule by the Luxembourg dynasty. But the funny thing, the funny thing about this is where you can see what in a concrete example, what I told you before about the use of religion to make a political oppositional point of view. Because there is no creed that you could say like, so Hussitism is a kind of like catch-all thing. It's a little bit like all the evangelicals in the Bible Belt. So they all generally share a certain subset of ideas, but if you would say like, so you're kind of like those people over there, they would say like, certainly not, because these people are bloody heretics, right?
Right.
So you would have a lot of these kinds of like, let's say, intra-denominational struggles as well, which kind of like subside the moment like a foreign marauding army comes into the country. So then they stick together, kick out the foreigners for like 15 or so years. But the reason I bring it up is the following. If you've been paying attention to the years and dates that I was telling you, so this is the 1410s. This is 30, 40 years before movable type printing. And it is a de facto Protestant Reformation, because we have letters from Martin Luther from the early 1520s, where he basically says something like, basically we're all Hussites. Which of course has two main implications. If you don't need the printing press, because it didn't exist to proselytize and spread a new creed, it calls into question the issue of like, what's the importance of movable type printing for the emergence of, you know, the Protestant Reformations.
Absolutely.
And the second issue is the Germans didn't invent it. You know, Luther it wasn't like 1521 or something, he specifically said like, basically everybody going back to St. Augustine and, you know, like the apostles, they were basically all Hussites, which is of course a stupid argument to make.
Right.
But he at least was open about it. One of the core problems with lots of like, especially my German colleagues, like, you know, very senior professors in early modern history, when they write about it. So the leading scholar, like recently retired, by the name of Heinz Schilling, he held a prestigious chair at the Humboldt University, which is like in Berlin, wrote a book with the title, is like more like a trade publication at the end of his long career in academia. I think it was 1517 was the title or something. And there is no mention. So I remember this because in 2017, I attended like a book launch chat, book talk or something. There was no mention about the Hussites, about the implications, etc. whatsoever in his lecture. Which incidentally is also why I ended up spending like dinner with him, which I didn't want to, because this was, you have to understand, this was like autumn 2017, and we had like a 4 or 5 month old daughter back at home. So I was like, so I'm attending the lecture out of a courtesy to my then boss at the university. And then So he also knew, my boss, my former boss, that I would ask questions that seemed like to kickstart, the discussion afterwards. Because typically after professors give a talk, people are reluctant to ask questions because they want to kind of like, is this a silly question? It's like,
Yeah.
it's only silly if you don't ask it, if you'd ask me. But the funny thing about this is like, so I asked a question about Hus, and this guy, Heinz Schilling, immediately goes like on the defensive. Yeah, of course I know about this and this, but I didn't say it. So like, okay, whatever. So I've done my part here. So I'm standing outside chatting with some of the attendees. They have like finger food and what have you. And then this guy, Schilling, comes over to me and says like, oh, there's something. This was so interesting. You seem to know a lot about this. What do you think about this, this, this? And I'm like, dude, you just wrote a book about this. Why are you asking me about the stuff that should be in your book? So long story short, he kind of like chatted me up for like an hour. I was like, I want to go home. Come on. I promised my wife I'd go home. And then my former boss comes in, with whom I had, let's say, disagreements, professionally speaking. And I was like, okay, at least I'm not supposed to go to dinner with them. So I'm still talking with our guest from Germany. And I was like, okay, now I finally can go home. And in the end, it was like, so the senior professor puts his hand on my shoulder, me, the lowly postdoc, or something like this, in terms of hierarchy. It's like, you're coming, isn't it? And I'm like,
oh, gosh.
I mean, it's like, these conversations are, to a certain extent, because you are in a like subordinate position.
In a hierarchy, right.
Yeah, you are within the hierarchy. You can't just say, me, no, thank you, I'd rather go home and bring my kid to sleep or something. But also sitting at those, at the restaurant. I mean, they at least had the courtesy to pay my bill in a Swiss restaurant, which was nice. But
yeah. Geez, I can imagine how expensive that would be. It's also what I'm sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, like, but also those conversations are like so superficial. You can't imagine it. It's like, sometimes these people, they just bring their wives, so then they talk about like, oh, how big are the kids? You sit there and think like, Jesus.
So the good thing, I think there's a positive in that sometimes, and this is something I criticize in academia, like, I love academia in the sense that I love knowledge and everything, but there's obviously parts about it that I have issues with. And one of those is that even if you're making a good point with certain senior professors, there is quite often they will, rather than be interested in what you have to say, if you're disagreeing with them, they will feel threatened by it, right?
Yeah.
So it seems like from what you just said that even if you were taking a different position than him somewhat, he was actually interested in what you have to say, which I think is positive.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
I think that's a very fair characterization, and in response, I would offer you a theory why that is.
Yeah, I'd love to hear
if you'd
it.
indulge me,
please.
So I would have to preface this by, I am a historian. The things that I left out of my kind of introduction, because I mean, I don't need to brag about this, but so I got my PhD from a place that's nowhere anywhere near like the top 250 universities, in whatever ranking.
Yeah,
so this
not
was
something I care about, but good to know. Yeah. As in, like, I don't care if you went to a lower university, it's irrelevant to me.
You see, the point is, this is the institution. If you want to understand how those rankings work, you need to find out what the factors are that are assessed and how they are weighed. Doesn't matter if it's Times Higher Education, doesn't matter if it's whatever other ranking you use. The thing that you do typically, if you are one of those kind of like Chronicle of Higher Education assesses, quality of campus, blah, 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 XYZ thing, is what they do is they look at three main categories. A is number of students, especially graduate students, per faculty.
Right.
This is the second thing, how many faculty versus students you have, this is where they kind of quote unquote cheat when they say like, this metric is typically based or very often on like the relationship between faculty, permanent faculty, and graduate students, which is not the entire student population. So they kind of like massage the numbers. And the third thing is budget.
Right.
And they lump everything together from, like Ivy League universities with endowments worth like, double-digit $1 billion.
Ridiculous.
To European public universities in Eastern Europe with, a very different, kind of like profile.
Right.
I have my PhD from the University of Graz, which is a wonderful place to be. And I just happen to know that, if you have a good quality research, you can make it, because I got my PhD. I'm saying this not to brag, so you can look this all up on the internet. But in 2011, I got my PhD, and in 2018, I get invited to a named visiting professorship at a fancy name place. It was at Columbia University.
Oh, wow.
So the reason why I skip over that part in any kind of introduction is because this is probably kind of like, oh, this guy's just used to bragging, blah blah blah. I don't give a shit about it, and I could tell you so many stories about academia that you would probably don't want to talk to any academic ever again, which is not what I want.
I would sit here and listen to it for 8 hours. It's a big part of what I do. Yeah.
But
sorry,
the funny thing about it is, like, where you got your degree doesn't really matter if you have a good quality product. And I'm not saying this, as I said, because I want to make myself a bigger, scholar, what have you, than I am. I'll just say, read my stuff, read the reviews by leading scholars in the field about my first book based on my PhD, and you will find out who I am in terms of quality, blah, blah, blah. But the point I wanted to make is, so the University of Graz is a small public university. It has about roughly the same amount of students, like give or take 30,000, than, say, the University of Bergen, where I am right now, and also Columbia and some of the bigger, Ivy League colleges. But it's a public university. So the reason why I say this is because the training that goes on at a public university in Central Europe is very different than, say, like, elite Ivy League colleges. I think that's,
Absolutely.
I don't need to explain or justify what I just said.
No.
But if you go back to the 3 items that I mentioned, number of students, number of faculty per student, or student per faculty, and budget. These are the 3 things that those kind of like, rankings typically kind of like emphasize. So Graz, the University of Zurich, where I spent almost a decade in Switzerland working there, also has about 30,000 students. But it has, if you could imagine, this is also very obvious, I forgot the numbers now, but it has a much higher budget for the simple reason.
Switzerland's a very rich country for those that
It's
don't
also
know.
a very expensive country.
Yes.
And Zurich is one of the most expensive places you can ever be. It's roughly in line with, say, like, Manhattan.
Right.
Which is not what I'm advocating going to. I'm just saying it's roughly in line in terms of like grocery prices, etc., rental prices, etc. Which is, I know this because I was at Columbia for some time. I mean, but the funny thing, this is why I mentioned this. The University of Vienna, where I got my first degree, has about 100,000 students. It has the same budget as the University of Zurich for less than a third of the students.
Yeah, I'm sure it does.
So we're talking about, in terms of like budgets, this is like, 1.2, 1.3 billion a year. It sounds a lot, but break it down into like, wait a second, one of these places has like 3 to 4 times the amount of students, and you can imagine where the rankings go. If you just think about the 3 grand categories, if you now put these 2 or 3 places like Vienna with in excess of 100,000 students and in excess of $1 billion in like annual budgets, put this in the same category as a place with 30,000 students like the University of Zurich with the same budget. Sure, you need to adjust for like, higher wage differentials, blah, 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 blah. But you can clearly see that there is a huge issue with the weighing of those parameters. And if you would now factor in like, Ivy League colleges like Columbia with an endowment, last time I bothered to check, north of 40 billion.
Yeah, and that's one of the smaller ones, by the way.
Endowment size, yes, but it's one of the larger ones in terms of like student numbers, as far as I remember this. But
right. For endowments, I think Yale and Harvard are and even Princeton are higher. But I just looked it up. It's 15 billion is their endowment.
Columbia or
Columbia, yeah. That's what
it
says.
As I said, but the point is, you have essentially the same number of students. You have much higher budgets. You have much higher, a much more favorable rating between a private elite college in the US versus like, a public university that trains a very different subset of the population.
Right.
So, but these are all lumped together in those rankings. And I can even give you like, I mean, if this wasn't bad enough, there are certain ways to game this kind of ranking game system thingy. So there is something in Austria which they did. So there was this physicist by the name of Zeilinger. He was one of particle physicists. He used to be at Stanford, but I think it was Stanford.
I've heard that name.
He was the guy who beamed particles on the West Coast.
Yeah.
So
I'm
like
looking him up now.
20 or so years, the Austrian government had one bright idea. We want to bring, those people who are super bright and super wonderful, leading scholars back home to kind of like boost innovation, blah, 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 blah. So they basically said, like, here's what we want you to do. There is a small place. It's like, it used to be a mental institution in the late 19th century, and they renovated it. It's like protected buildings, etc. They said, like,
Yeah.
if you want to come back from like Stanford or the Bay Area, what have you, from your fancy world leading, like, I think he was even like shared a Nobel Prize in physics or what have you.
Yeah, I saw that. He did.
So if you want to come back, what's your price? And he said, like, why? I would like to have like my own university. So they gave him like the area, they renovated it, said like, here's a budget, you have 15 years, do what you do. It's the Austrian Institute of Science and Technology. And in one of those rankings, after like 15 or so years, this must have been like either just before COVID hit or just thereafter, that institution was second only to MIT in one of those rankings. How did they do this? Because you go like, wait a second, I have never really heard about it. How did they do this? It's very simple. They only have graduate and postdoc students, which in the STEM subjects is the most protective segment of any academics.
Yeah.
So basically those places will tell you, if you haven't made it until you're 35, you're done.
Oh.
Yeah, if you don't make it into like professorship position level, something in the STEM subject, this is like what people at ETH, it's the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology, told me a couple of years ago. So 35 is kind of like, you don't make it until then, go find something else to do. But if you are like a STEM researcher, you can find a lot of like industry options, which is also why salaries are higher, reputation is higher in the STEM subjects, because you have competition, which is very different from the humanities and the social sciences.
Right.
But the way they gamed the system is they said, like, you only have graduate students, like PhDs and postdocs.
Right.
There's a lot of budget with a very highly selective, like, application and admission procedure, and a very favorable, like, it's almost like 2-to-1, like 2 graduate postdoc students per faculty member. So
that's insane.
No, I mean, and should it be 5 to 10, depending on the field whatsoever, but this is how you game the system. This is how you move up in the rankings. So those rankings, basically, they don't mean a thing. It's a way to kind of like fleecing, especially if you're a public university chairman or president or what have you. They would go, and I've seen this with the University of Zurich. This is funny. I'll humor you one more moment with this kind of like stupid anecdote, but I've seen this. So we got like a person who was like biologist by training, something like this, had a career in the US. He was invited to become the president of the University of Zurich. This was 2016, 17, something like this. So, which is a very well-paid position, Swiss national, highly acclaimed, blah, blah, blah. Me being a historian, never heard of him, but doesn't matter. So he was the president of the university. He's since moved on to ETH, which is higher in the rankings. ETH is the MIT equivalent in Switzerland. It's also one of the very few European universities that's like regularly in like around top 10 spots in all those rankings.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So he moved up from like, someplace in Northern America to the University of Zurich, which is like around 80, 90-ish in the rankings. But also it has to do with, like the Swiss school system is highly selective. They have a high budget. And then he moved to ETH, which is like, 7, 8, 9, 10, something like this in the global rankings. And the funny thing about this is why I said they fleeced the public. Because when this guy was still at Hengarter, was his name, when he was still at the University of Zurich, he would regularly go to like, the appropriations committee meetings in state parliaments, and because it's a public university run by the state, would go like cap in hand, like, can I have more money? I want to be like Harvard. Which, if you think about it, makes sense if you want to have like a couple of more million of dollars or funding, what have you.
Yeah.
But it's, at some point you'd have to come up with this notion that like he's them. If the
Right.
politicians don't know that they shouldn't be there. But if they know that this is BS, they are participating. This goes back to like the
Yeah.
performative aspect of a lot of academia.
Seriously, that's my least favorite part
And
about it.
no, I mean, I can make an argument about this that the worst people who are in this charade are neither the academics nor the politicians, but the journalists who refuse to call a spade a spade. Because if you have an institution that has, like, with the University of Zurich, like roughly 30,000 students plus faculty, blah, 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 they have like an excess of $1 billion of like a public funded budget. You go there and say, like, can I have 15 more millions? Sure, you go like, sounds like a lot of money, isn't it? But if you go and like, the argument is like, I would like to have like, I need a new building, I need a new library, I want to hire like, more specialists in this or that field. That is an argument that you could get behind him. But the argument wasn't like, I need a new building, I want to hire like, a couple of specialists in this field, blah, blah, blah. No, the argument was like, give me 10, 15 more million funding, and in like a couple of years, we may be like Harvard, which is like ridiculous.
It's a 400-year university. You can't compete with that. That's ridiculous, no matter how much money you throw at it.
No, and I mean, the funny thing about academia in this regard is like, if you are one of those at those places, and and I'll just throw this out just so that the reader, the listeners and viewers, maybe they can understand this. What I didn't know as a European, being invited to an Ivy League college as a visiting professor, I thought like, oh God, I'm going to Columbia, but there is so many distinctions in a Bourdieuian sense. What I didn't understand is like, if you have like a named, endowed, blah, blah, blah. In my case, it was Istvan Deák visiting professorship at Columbia University. I'm forever grateful. And it was a wonderful experience. And this is the best part about academia. You kind of like get to meet the most amazing colleagues, even if you have never met them and they don't know who you are. They look at, oh, you have a named professorship, you must be capable. So it's like, it's this kind of like weird kind of like, you're part of the in-group, even though you didn't know. In my case, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I had a friend explain it to me in like a couple of months later. But it is just, but you get to meet, it's like a door opener. You are treated in a very different way wherever you go. I had a very dear friend, shout out to my friend Molly Taylor Poleski. She's now at Harvard, got a PhD from Stanford. But in 2018, when I was at Columbia, she was teaching at Middle Tennessee State University. For those of you Americans who don't know where this is, Murfreesboro, Tennessee, been there.
Okay. I'm sure we're going to have, there's one listener from that area who's just like freaking out right now. Like, oh, that's my place.
The funny
I've
thing
never
is,
even heard of it, but yeah.
Me neither, but Molly was there. I knew Molly. And she said like, yeah, if you're at Columbia, you probably don't even want to come to like this lowly undergrads only state university. I was like, I don't care.
Right.
I would
That's
come
the right
because,
attitude to have.
I mean, Molly was kind enough to set me up with a bunch of like high profile people at Vanderbilt, which was like 40 miles away in Nashville.
Oh, okay. So yeah, I know Vanderbilt, obviously.
In exchange, but it's like 40 miles south of Nashville.
Yeah, one of my favorite cities in America, by the way. It's Nashville.
I've been there for like about 36 hours, but I got the same reception by people that I had never known. They come, they pick you up, they treat you like you're one of them. And this is the best part about academia. If you make it into those kinds of circles, however you do that, if you make it into those kinds of circles, I would also say that these circles, you can only your way into them, these circles, to a certain degree, because as soon as people find out you're a fraud, they don't want to keep you in those circles. It's like every in-group, out-group dynamics.
Right. And when you say a fraud, like what would that mean practically?
Well, it depends on like, I mean, the obvious options there would be like quality of your output, if you just stopped publishing, or if you would, do something that's incredibly stupid, like sexually harass students or something.
Yeah.
But
that's a good thing that gets you out of the in-group, I think.
I would have to add, though, there is a caveat with the sexual harassment thing, because a lot of those things are arbitrated internally by what I lovingly, with great affection to Australian wildlife, call kangaroo courts.
Yes. And of course, the university doesn't want to have that attached to them. they
Yeah,
might
yeah,
just sweep it under the rug, right?
yeah. This is what these internal arbitration committees typically do, and I'm not going to name any names. I've said where I was in 2018 at Columbia, so I'm not going to give you any more names about this. But here's me, the little European, at the it was, I think, the Christmas farewell party. There was an open bar. I was talking to a couple of people that I had never seen who were technically in the same department as I was, and for whatever reason, we talk about this, and there was a scandal. This was all over, like, New York Times, what have you, a couple of years earlier. Like, a very senior, like, retired professor, and, like, I think it was classics, Roman history, whatever. He kind of, like, couldn't, resist chasing after Evi's skirt, I have been told.
Oh God.
And this was arbitrated in, like, one of those internal don't do this, slap on the wrist kind of like things. And so me, the ignorant European, says, like, that sounds like a kangaroo court. I mean, isn't this even worse if everybody knows that this is a farce? To which my interlocutor said, like, but you don't understand. You see, the point is, this is bad with the people who pay us. And I'm like, wait a second, you have like 7-8% admission rate. I mean, you could really kind of like make it if your admission rate goes to 8.5 to 9%. It's like, yeah, but you see, you don't understand.
Right.
That's not our people that pay us. He was, of course, talking about big money, rich people donating to the university.
Right. Right.
So
incentive structure is very important.
Right. And so if you can sweep this under the rug, as you mentioned, of course that's good, because then you don't have a scandal. But the scandal is not the problem. The problem is what the donors might do, like, oh, we had plans for this development of a new campus over there or something. That now needs to be a little bit like postponed. That's bad. So this is the kind of thing.
Right. And they don't care about the actual victims in practicality. Doesn't matter.
I would think it goes into the possible blackmail file of some 4 or 5 letter agency for, later usage.
Yeah, I mean, now we're getting into my stuff. Great. Yeah.
No, let's be honest. I mean, most academics, they are not that important. But I would just say one more thing about this, because it sounds like academia is this kind of like cesspool of, like, corruption, incompetence, fraud, imposters, etc.
Any institution is like that.
It is all of this.
Right.
But it is also one of the things where I really have to add, it's all of this and then some, but it's also a place where you can really find cool people, find amazing, interesting people. And if you are in, as I said, like certain in-group level kind, it's like you get to meet like the most interesting people you can talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And
absolutely,
in my opinion, in my experience, it's also like the internationally leading top scholars are also like the most humble, most like, I don't care about like titles and things like this.
Right.
I'm interested in what you're doing kind of like people.
Yeah. Because they apply their passion and intelligence to their work rather than a step below that where it's people really just trying to climb the ladder, in my experience.
Yeah. And this is where, like, I'm not saying, those people are all perfect. I mean, I'm not perfect by a far stretch of any kind of imagination. But I would also say that, like, it doesn't exclude that there aren't shenanigans going on. But the likelihood that you find people who bring with them their passion and they continue doing this because they are interested in this kind of stuff is higher the higher up you go in that kind of hierarchy.
Right. Absolutely. And that's, I was talking to my friend about this a while ago, right? It's like, obviously I'm not in academia myself, but having a, compared to other podcasts, I'm relatively small, but still somewhat significant in like the thousands of people that watch or listen. And it's nice that I can use that to then talk to interesting people like you, because I have something different to offer. Even though I'm not in the actual academia, I still love academics and getting to talk to interesting people.
So if you like to look at vintage postcards from Europe and all over the place, go to espc.substack.com. This is where
I'm going to put that in the description as well.
That's very kind of you. But so I'll have to preface this with a couple of moments here, because the reason why I ended up like in the early modern period was at some point during like my university studies, I realized that even though I'm supremely interested in the 20th century, I think everybody should be,
Mm-hmm.
because it's the most relevant for our existence. But it's like, I realized that whatever you research, there is like literally nothing, if you come from Central Europe, that you could research with an open mind and with an open end inside, as in like let the evidence guide you, because there are so many red flags and like guardrails, etc. So this is how I ended up. So I did my master's thesis about 15th century diplomacy in Renaissance Italy, which was fun. I did my PhD about 16th century Republic of Venice history. I did, which is customary in German language academia, you write a second dissertation, you get a fancy degree, you get jump through like all the hoops. We're not getting into this. That would be something else to discuss. And this is where I put out, it just came out, it's called Lordship and State Transformation, came out with McGill as we speak, like in December, McGill University Press. It's a wonderful book if you ever want to talk to me about like, taxes in the late 17th century in southern Bohemia. I could go on for hours about this, but the reason why I say this is like, so it took me some time to kind of like translate, revise, etc. the German language 200,000 word manuscript into a somewhat more readable English language monograph.
Oh, good Lord.
And so you're expected in German language academia to write a second PhD, which is twice as long. But it's also supposed to be on a substantially different topic. This is
two
the German
dissertations. I'm lost here. I know the Germans are industrious, but that's ridiculous.
It's both. But on the other hand, I would have to say this is one of the cool differences. It goes back to what you said about like it's hard to find people in America to be interested in this stuff. But it's also increasingly hard for European scholars to kind of like find employment with that kind of research expertise, because especially the further west you go, the fewer such positions in pre-modern European history there would be.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of funding, a lot of hiring is now going into quote-unquote ethnic studies, as well as into like,
yes,
Chinese studies.
Oh.
And yeah, because China, especially if you go to California, there's a lot of like, public and private universities funding Chinese history stuff, much like, in the, like after World War II, a lot of stuff was like German history focused.
Mm-hmm.
So because Germans needed re-educating.
Yes.
But it's like, there's so few of those positions now, and those kinds of things are kind of like a niche almost.
Mm-hmm.
But the reason why I bring it all up is like it took some time. So I got the second doctorate kind of degree thing qualification in 2018, at the end of 2018. And I've spent like 4 years thereafter putting out my book, which is now out. But during the COVID time, my mom calls me and says like, you know what, we do have your grandfather's picture postcard collection. And it has, my grandfather died in 88. My grandmother died in 2000. And for like 20 plus years, there's like 800 kilograms worth of picture postcards. My mom says it's about 40,000. So
that's
I haven't
about
counted
2,000 pounds for Americans who can't do the translation. That's ridiculous.
It's a ridiculous amount. There is a couple of like boxes here behind me. But
how much does a postcard weigh? A few ounces? This must be tens of thousands of.
Couple of grams, I think.
Wow.
But the funny thing about it is like, so my mom says like, we had some time. We had them like in there, like, like the small cottage and storage for like 20 plus years. And so like, yeah, now that we have some time, maybe we should think about getting rid of them. But my mom doesn't want to throw them away. So she says like, do you want to have them? And I go like, sure. It took me like hours to kind of like figure out this, having discussions over the phone with the Norwegian customs and border people, with the tax office, to figure out how to import something that is essentially worthless.
Yeah. Did they consider it worthless?
Yeah, but they said like, look, I see this, but you got to talk to the tax office. This is what customs said, because they had farmed out this thing, like import stuff, to like the tax office. The tax office said like, we don't know about this, talk to the customs people. I was like, oh, no, you don't give me the runaround here.
Yes,
I just need to know which forms. I don't care how many hoops. I just need to know what I need to fill out. So in the end, this is like a story of bureaucracy, which I have studied for like 15 years now.
Yeah.
Which made me probably much calmer in dealing with bureaucrats over the phone than I would otherwise have been. But the thing is, it's out. So the postcards were in Austria, which is inside the European Union. I am in Norway, which is outside. So there is
Right.
a customs thing, even though as an individual, because of the Schengen agreement, I could, travel without passports or things like this.
Mm-hmm.
So long story short, I had to get in touch with the local West Norwegian Postcard Collectors Association. Charming people, lovely folk.
I'm sure they were great. Yeah.
They were awesome, because the tax official at some point said, like, could you kind of like, an email is sufficient, no forms, whatever, just have him confirm the approximate worth that's not zero, because nobody's going to believe this.
Right.
So I made up the fictional worth of my postcard collection of like $200 something. But I also talked to like the shipping company in Austria, because they
Right,
said
because
like,
you can't transport that in a car, right?
no. So it was like on a pallet. It was like 800 kilograms. It's like, relocation crates. And the funny thing is, like, there were two problems actually. One was like getting it into Norway, but before that you'd need to bring it out of Austria.
Mm-hmm.
So you need an export license.
Oh God.
And if you write down like, look, dude, this is like 40,000 picture postcards, they are worthless. I'm spending more money moving all of them to Norway than I would ever kind of like get out of this, because even if I'd sell it like per kilo to burn it, it's like, it's not a good deal for me.
No.
So there's like, yeah, but if you write down like €2, the customs official will come back to you and harass you, because that's just not credible enough.
Right.
I'll add parenthetically, customs officials are my least favorite bureaucrats, because, even if we send like used toys to my in-laws, like 2-year-old, and write on the customs declaration of the parcel, like, this is a used board game, it has like €2 of worth, and this is like a used cuddly animal, which is worth like €2. They then have to pay up, because customs officials don't believe that this is in. It's insane, even though, and this is insane, by the way, because everything below, I think it's 100 or 150 euros or dollars, is kind of like customs free.
Yeah, which is
So
what
if they
it
don't
should
believe you, yeah, exactly. So if they don't believe you, you just have to pay. In the end, I got them all here, and now I'm sitting there. So this is why I came up with this idea. So I use it as props for teaching. I gave a couple of presentations based on it. I use it wherever I can in publications. So for instance, I'm going to do some shameless advertising. But for instance, my book, the jacket, the cover illustration is based on one of the postcards, which I could probably pull out of, the collection right here. I didn't really prepare this, but in terms of like, I have them here. So it's one of those things that I can do. So this is the picture postcard that the book jacket is based on.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
And the funny thing about these is, if you think about it, it's like the pictures are nice. The oldest one that I've found so far is, I think, 1897 or something. Incidentally, Hungarian ones.
Oh, fantastic.
And so I'm now talking to McGill, Queen's University Press, about putting together another book proposal, and I will write something about this postcard.
And that's McGill
collection.
University in Quebec, you're saying?
Yes.
Oh, interesting.
Publisher of my book here, and the funny thing about it is, like, you could make a lot of like, you can narrate a lot of stories about this. So you could make studies into like technological change, because the older postcards, I'll probably just pull out those again that I just held in my hand to show them, if people are interested in this, because I think it is. So this is from Kasa Košice in present-day Slovakia. Can you see this?
So that's very interesting, because that's very near my grandmother's village, actually.
That's fun.
I think. Wait, how do you spell that?
Kassa is the Hungarian version, and Košice is Košice. ICE. There's the thing
Yes.
is,
Oh my gosh, that's ridiculous. This was for those that don't know. Large parts of Hungarian land with Hungarian nationals were taken by the surrounding territory, Slovakia, Romania,
yeah,
actually a little bit for Austria after World War I. I don't understand Austria because they were on the same side, but
it's the
but
thing.
that's the city that's outside of my grandmother's village in Slovakia, what used to be Hungary. That's
The world's
incredible.
a pretty small place, because I have a friend, dear friend, Georg Michels, who teaches at UC Riverside. He's married to a woman whose grandparents are from the same area, so I do have those things here scanned, so I'll send them later to you by
Please.
email if you want to.
Yes, I'd love them.
The reason I mention it is, and I'll just hold up, so this is St. Elizabeth's Church in Košice, present-day Slovakia. The reason I hold this up is I find them beautiful, but it's also because this is pre-World War One. So they are, I think, printed, so they had like glass negatives where the image is etched into the glass, then they are
Right.
printed and colored after the fact, which is why you get these bright colors. And if I'll just hold up a more or less random, like, do I have anything from like the Cold War? Oh God, no. And the funny thing about the Cold War era things, so this is a different place in Czechia, but you get like those printed ones, like on cardboard.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like, was never sent, but I'm thinking like it's like 70s or something. But the
Yeah.
reason why I point this out is like, so you could, and in between, like in the interwar period, you would get like the picture postcards that I just showed you before, which is also on my book cover. They would have like on the reverse written like true photograph, to indicate that this is not, like some print that is
Yeah.
colored after it's been printed. And then you have like cheaper versions of the photographs in the 50s. They are still black and white. And then in like around 1960ish, you get like the modern version of like, colored printed cardboard photographs on as a postcard. So there is a technological change that is there. There is also the notion about, I call it the lost art of writing postcards, because some people write like just best wishes, see you soon. A lot of people would send a postcard and add like letter follows. So they write a postcard when they arrive, and then when they have time, sit down, write letters, because it's, these are, so this is from, where is this from? This is fine. So this is a good one. So this is from someplace in Slovakia.
Oh my
This is
gosh.
pre-World War One,
Yes.
which you can sometimes identify by seeing like the stamp.
Oh yeah, that's the Austro-Hungarian emperor.
Exactly.
It's
So
incredible.
this one is probably like 1912, 13 or something. But the funny thing about it is like, so they would kind of like write sometimes just a couple of like words.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes these are like, filled out. I've even seen some things, like what I've seen now is people in the 50s using typewriters to send greetings on the backside of a picture postcard. I've even seen like, this is late 70s, early 80s, people who would pre-print at home like a short text and then glue it to the backside. So this is I did 2 postings about Madeira in the Azores in Portugal on my Substack a couple of days ago, where I put one of those things up. So you would see a lot of those things. And if you see, especially like the computer printed version that's glued to the postcard, you have to think about it in terms of like, so this is from Eric Hobsbawm's Age of Extremes, which is Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm, who actually wrote a somewhat decent book about the 20th century called The Age of Extremes, where he speaks about the 50s and 60s in the US and in the West. It's the functional equivalent of the anecdote that relates in rural America, where people would go to church and bring jelly for after church, cafe situations. Not because everybody suddenly started to like jelly, but because by bringing jelly, you would show your neighbors that you had a fridge. So
I've never heard that, but that makes sense.
By printing, like, in the early 80s, something that you would glue on your holiday vacation postcard that you send out. You would show that you have access to both the computer and the printer.
Wow. Yeah.
So
High class,
this
huh?
is
That's
it's like you show off your status by
right.
implication, and everybody who's around knows this. It's a little bit like, casually pulling, like 20 years ago, first iPhone came out in 2007,
Mm-hmm.
using like those white Apple product things.
Right. Right.
It's a status symbol. You symbolize something in addition to its function.
Yes.
So I've gone way off there, but the thing
No,
is,
that's great. Look, cultural anthropology. You're saying all this stuff is so relevant to cultural anthropology and class and all this. I love this stuff.
so this is this. So I call it the lost art of writing picture postcards, because there is like what's very well established now is like you had like siblings. For instance, I've found somebody in World War One who was with the Austrian occupation troops in Albania, and his brother was in Vienna. So they sent each other postcards, 1916, 17, 18. And we said, like, can you please get these picture postcards? Send them to me. I'll mail them back. So you'd have those tandems mailing picture postcards from exotic places.
Exotic places. Wonderful. Yeah, that's what for it.
And so they would do that. You would see, I mean, my grandfather apparently liked to so he collected this after World War II.
Mm-hmm.
World War II, he was born in 1922. He was drafted into the German army in 1941, spent 2.5 years on the Eastern Front, which he survived.
Mm-hmm. He survived the Eastern Front?
Yes, so I do have some memoirs. I have some diary-like memoirs that he kept kind of diary-like in like small pocket calendars, notes. And in the early 80s, he started to type them up as a kind of like autobiographical memoir-like thing. So I have a very detailed account from 37 through 43. Nothing for 44, by the way, which is very bad for me.
Yeah.
Because he was with Army Group Center, which was when it was annihilated in summer 44.
Yeah. In Stalingrad, right?
No. The Stalingrad was earlier. So, but the single biggest military defeat German armies ever suffered was in 1944 in summer. It's called Operation Bagration.
I thought the majority of that group was killed or captured and kept until like 1950.
Yeah, something like this. But so the Soviet troops overran the Army Group Center. My grandfather ends up in what's called the Kurland pocket. It's like, one of those cauldrons, and he's evacuated across the Baltic on the night of December 31st, 44 and January 1st, 45. So I do have some stuff that's still in Vienna at my mother's and my aunt's. I do think about like writing something with the postcards and using like biographical fragments, because the collection is highly eclectic in terms of like a lot of postcards he got from friends. So you have like picture postcards. I'll just reach over there. So I have about 25 or 30 written by a German doctor to his wife from 1918 through 41, 42, something. So I'm thinking about like using biographies or fragments of biographies from ordinary people, like C.S. Lewis in Weight of Glory would call ordinary people. Like, there are no ordinary people.
Absolutely. I love this. There's so much value in this, regardless of the monetary value.
To use like those biographical fragments to kind of like switching from like what is written on, like, because it's a public performative act, because that this is not a private letter. Some of the wartime postcards would carry like censorship approval stamps or something. So it's a kind of like, it's a way of like dressing up to step outside, is what you write down. Right. So using those kinds of like considerations to have like a narrative about the 20th century that's biographical in nature.
Absolutely.
Fragments of different people. There's also a sizable contingent of picture postcards, which my grandfather, after World War II, categorized and filed in Cold War era borders. So, this is why the
and he was in Austria at the
yeah.
time. Yeah.
This is why the Slovakia themed postcards, which I showed you from pre-World War One, Hungary, are in the Czechoslovakia box and not with the Slovakia box.
Right. Yeah.
So the thing is this. So this is what I have. There's so many picture postcards also from what areas that used to be inhabited by Germans in Eastern Europe.
Right.
Which he kept for, I think, both nostalgic reasons, but also it would enable me, because there's places that no longer exist, buildings, places and things, to kind of like write or think about one of the chapters as like places that no longer exist, and we only have like a couple of picture postcards here.
Right, yeah. There's not a lot from Gdansk that's left. Did I pronounce
Exactly.
that right? Almost definitely not. I did.
And there's a lot of like other places. And I would have to add one more thing there. So my grandfather, after World War II, so in 44, 45, he's evacuated across the Baltic Sea.
He's very lucky that he was able to get out. That's incredible.
Oh, he was also very lucky that his ship wasn't sunk.
Yeah.
So the family legend has it that he never went into any body of water further than his waistline after World War II. I don't know how much of this is true, because he died when I was 6, and whatever I remember may not be remembrance, but family lore, so it's a little tricky to figure out. I think it makes for a wonderful ethnographic consideration, though.
Yes, no, it does.
But so the thing is, after World War II, so he goes back to, he's like on leave after he made it out of the Kurland pocket. This is January 45. He's battlefield promoted, so he starts as like a draftee, like private. And in spring 45, he's promoted to lieutenant of the reserve.
Oh, so wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's...
Well, that's what happens when everybody dies. Yeah.
That is kind of the point I was alluding to. But
God,
at the end of hostilities, he is in Pilsen in present-day Czechia, where he is taken POW by Patton's troops.
Thank God that it was them and not the Soviets.
Well, this is one of the things. So I mentioned my friend before. His father, who passed a couple of years ago at the tender age of over 90, he was one of the last people who was drafted. Like, he was a teen in 45, who was also in what is today Czechia. And that poor man survived the war by running towards the Red Army lines for his life because of the Czech partisans.
Oh, yeah. It's crazy that the Soviets would be better than that. But some of those Central and Eastern European partisans are terrifying.
Yes. The thing is, I mean, this is also footnote thingy there in terms of like, because I have a lot of Czech friends. I cherish my friendship with our Czech neighbors, and I don't mean to talk them in any way, shape, or form. I happened to go to a conference in Pardubice in Czechia in September 2023, and there was a couple of colleagues. There's a research group which you actually might be interested in, into anthropologically speaking. So there's Peter Wohlmuth. That's Wohlmuth. He's at Charles University in Prague, and they are studying with anthropological and ethnographic methods. They are studying World War II reenactment groups. It's a highly strange group in East Central Europe. Yeah. And they gave a paper presentation about them, because imagine the absolute madness of having far right-wing Czechs in their spare time dressing up with Wehrmacht and SS uniforms, playing World War II in some Czech forest.
Oh, God. Okay.
And if you think about, like, wait a second, can you repeat this because this sounds insane? It's probably because it is insane.
Yeah.
I mean, I personally, my stance is, if people want to reenact some stuff like this, there's worse hobbies, like, doing drugs or getting drunk or what have you.
Yeah.
But there's like, nuances there, I would add. But
we have that in America, mostly with Civil War reenactors, and
but
most of them are benign, but
yeah, they're cute. I mean, they don't even wash for a week and shave for a week, so they kind of like stink like it, which I find hilarious, honestly. And as I said, there's way worse hobbies. So I don't want to, say anything denigratingly or whatever. But the thing with the Czech reenactors is, and this holds true for sizable contingent of like-minded reenactment players playing World War II in Eastern Central Europe. The question is, so you would need to gain their trust, because you can imagine, would not let outsiders, especially like typically left-leaning academics, into their vicinity and then write studies, whatever. But
and there's legality there as well in certain
apart
places.
from that,
because in America you can say whatever you want mostly, but that's interesting.
I mean, in the Czech context, there is this other thing, because the ethnic cleansing of the German speakers after World War II in 45, 46.
Insane
that was based
Bohemian
on
descendants are doing that, but
it's like but this was based on what's called the Beneš decrees, and they are still in force. And when Czechia acceded to the European Union, Germany didn't raise a fuss about it. Neither did Austria, by the way. But there are legal opinions by the most learned legal scholars about, wait a second, this is not really compatible with European treaties, etc. Blah blah blah. But they kept it on the books, because the Czechs said, because they accepted the crimes committed in the context from, say, early 45, could be late 44, to sometime in 46. If you even capital crimes like homicides, they are, you will not get prosecuted. That's the Czech law.
So they just
and this
did
is
a blanket. Okay.
Yeah. So this is why it's. I mean,
right.
This is the most extreme case, but the most, in terms of the strangest thing about it. But the weirdest thing about it is and this connects this part of World War II history, I would argue, to intimately to the present. If you think about the current quagmire in Ukraine, NATO expansion, etc. The problem there is, if you look at why would Eastern Europeans in particular be so rabidly Russophobic, it is precisely because of being first sold out by the Germans, especially with respect to Poland, the Baltics, parts of Finland, and parts of Romania, which were all attacked by the Soviet Union in 1939-40. And I mean, this is also, if you listen to Vladimir Putin, Lavrov, and all the other Russian politicians, they will also tell you, we liberated Europe from the yoke of Nazi tyranny, which is
of course you did.
Yes,
of course you did, buddy. That's
it's just like we conveniently leave out the 40 years of communist hellhole dictatorship.
Leave out 1956 in Hungary. Leave out Romania and
68 in Czechoslovakia. Exactly. So you can understand why Eastern Europeans are kind of reluctant, on the one hand, to kind of talk to the Russians, why they would like to get into NATO in the first place, which is something, by the way, for the record, I'll say, there were so many promises given. There was no secret treaty or something, but, a lot of international relations is based on trust. Yes. And if you abuse trust, it does not bode well. Having said that, if you talk to, say, people from the Baltic states, people from Poland, people from, you mentioned a bunch of them, but you could also talk, and this goes directly to Finland getting into NATO because they are afraid that the Russians would do something.
Again,
If you talk to Finns, shortly after the Soviet Union, a couple of weeks after the Germans attacked, I say the Germans, my mother tongue is German, my culture is German. I would have to put this out there too, in terms of quote unquote heritage, even though my citizenship is Austria.
Right. Germanic.
Probably have another 2-hour conversation about the absurdities of post-World War II Austrian identity, but I don't think that is very, rewarding for either of us. But you talk to Finns, they have experienced the same as the Baltic states or the Poles, with the Soviet Union attacking in the so-called Winter War in what was it, October or November 1939. I just happened to have a very lovely Finnish colleague whose grandfather was one of the few surviving soldiers, had to give up the lands ceded to the Soviet Union, which is the present border between Russia and Finland, by the way, fixed in 1940. And, they would have to leave. They would be ethnically cleansed out of fear of the Soviet troops in 1939-40. And you talk to Finnish people about it, you have absolutely no problems understanding why the Finns would like to have somebody else standing next to them in the present moment. So, the problem there is, of course, a lot of these things come with levels of and layers of like hybridity, multiple meanings for different groups, etc. So it's like every kind of blanket term is typically not helpful. And so it is with the picture postcards. Because my grandfather, after World War II, because he was captured by Patton, who held certain, let's say, convictions about the defeated National Socialist enemy, and
I think
his
Patton wanted to
notional
keep
ally.
going to Moscow.
Well, he wasn't the only one, if you consider the British kind of like secret operation unthinkable. Like, just, draft the Germans, say, you now need to go back again. But the funny thing...
I actually support that as well, by the way. I think they should have, but...
it's always easy, hindsight being 20/20 vision. But the weird thing about this, so my grandfather was lucky to survive 2.5 years on the Eastern Front.
Very, very lucky.
He was extremely traumatized.
I can not even imagine.
The weirdest thing, so this is like on All Souls Day and on Armistice Day, I put up, because he tried to work out his trauma by writing short stories and poems. So I put up 2 of his wartime poems that were published in an anthology in the 1960s on the occasion. I translated them. There's the original as well. So they're all on the Substack. So he published this in 1968. He has a couple of like short stories. So there are more than quote unquote biographical fragments and memoirs. Why do I mention this? The reason why I mention it is because after World War II, so in 1945, he's taken prisoner by the Americans. Let's go quickly. I even have his discharge certificate from Patton's Third Army. It's in the Austrian State Archive.
Oh, wow. Where was he captured again?
In Plzeň, in present-day Czechia, Western Czechia. It's Plzen.
Right. I'm trying to figure out if my grandfather was... Do you know what specific unit he surrendered to?
I not like at the top of my head.
That's
so
okay.
I would have to check it out. But so after he is discharged quickly, and unlike the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers on the Western Front that are put into quote unquote POW camps in the so-called Rheinwiesenlager, where they are treated very badly against all the conventions, by the way, because the American occupation troops came up with a new category of like disarmed enemy combatant or something. Because if you thought, and I'm not saying this to kind of like denigrate the U.S. military,
you can denigrate the U.S. military as much as you want.
No, but like when the U.S. attacked Iraq in 2003, they came up with a new category of enemy combatant, blah blah blah, to deny the POWs their rights under the Geneva Convention. And this is not the first time, because the American troops did this in 1945 with the German soldiers that they took into captivity. So
this is news to me. So please,
as much as you want. It's one of the things that a few people... I didn't know this until a couple of years ago, but it's like, so they just put them like on the meadows near the Rhine, and that was it. So no food, like starvation rations, no food, no drink, no shelter, no nothing.
Huh.
And this is, it's one thing if I mentioned before, the lies being spewed about World War II by the Russians. I would say like it's an equal opportunity lying thing, because I'm not saying that the Western allies and the Soviets are the same.
But they're still...
They are lying about different aspects to this day, by the way. And I'm not saying this to sugarcoat anything that has to do with Hitler Germany or anything, just for the record to be perfectly clear.
No, that's fine. But you don't even have to add that on. It's okay.
But the issue there is, so my grandfather was so lucky because he was taken by Patton's soldiers, who quickly let him go after a couple of weeks. So he walks home to Vienna, where he meets the woman that he later marries, my grandmother. And they get married in 1947. My uncle is born in 1948. And for about 10-15 years, he first does like literally any kind of job that he can do. Then in the 1950s, he spends time as a teacher. like teaching history and religion, like Catholic religion at the variety of ecclesiastical schools. And in 1961, he then signs up with the Austrian army. Apparently, by then, it was obvious that he was a competent and seasoned veteran with combat experience against the correct enemy. This is my interpretation there.
Right, the Soviets.
Exactly.
So he was lucky to have, not lucky, but ultimately in that moment, lucky to have fought not the Allies, but the Soviets.
To a certain extent. I mean, of course, they had like checked him out, his papers, etc. I mean, in like it was like 46 or 7, he was briefly with, like what's called the B Gendarmerie, which is like, paramilitary unit put together by the US. So he already was okay-ish.
Yeah.
But he joins the Austrian army, and because of his prior wartime service, he becomes a career officer, starts, I think, enlists as a major, and then it takes them about a year to process everything, all the materials, and he's quickly promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he retired a colonel.
Wow.
In the early 1980s.
Wow.
And he was with an anti-aircraft artillery unit, which is the tank hunters. So they also shoot at aircraft, but they typically shoot at Soviet tanks in World War II.
Wow.
So after World War II, he is in the 60s, 70s, in his 50s, 60s, he is an instructor at the anti-aircraft artillery school. And this is where he has apparently a lot of contact with other veterans. My mom always tells me my father never talked to me about this. And I'm like, Mom, forgive me for saying this. I have 2 daughters. They're like 7 and almost 11. I'm not they're like the last people on earth that I would share like work-related stuff. And if I mean, you're a veteran. I don't know if you have kids, but it's like, would you share that kind of thing with your daughters? It's like the last people I would share any of it with.
No. Yeah, I don't have kids yet, but I've also never been in combat as well. No. But I've only recently shared with my sister that I never told them at the time, but I nearly I nearly went down into the ocean in a helicopter, and
oh God.
I did not tell anybody. Well, I told people, but I never told any of my family about that, especially while I was still in. I didn't want them, concerned that something like that could happen again. But I will never fly in a helicopter as long as I live.
Well, I've never been on board a helicopter, but helicopter.
Don't do it.
No, I don't intend to. Don't worry. Where I live, Bergen is like, together with Stavanger, it's like the center of it's like the base camp airport stations for offshore oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. If you want to go down a really odd rabbit hole, go on YouTube and look for North Sea oil rig storm.
Oh,
This is like, crab fishing in the Bering Straits, if you remember the deadliest catch.
Yeah, I've seen some of those videos. Yeah, insane.
That kind of like insanity, right. But it's also
things
like
that
why
songs
we have
are
a lot of
about.
Like helicopter traffic going back and forth from here to like, the oil rigs and things like this. So it's like, I would never do it. I mean, personally, I would be interested to visiting an oil rig just out of curiosity.
Yeah, take a boat.
Yeah, but having watched the North Sea videos, I'm not sure. Don't
go. Just don't do it.
The thing is, you would have to have like a lot of like security, safety, additional training, which costs a fortune, and I'm like kind of like reluctant to spend money on it to simply go there for like 2 hours, even though curiosity. No, but the thing is like, so one of the texts that he wrote in like, I think in the late 1960s is about setting the scene where he sits down after like church on Sunday with somebody who he refers to in his prose writing as the major. No names given. You have to imagine those 2 veterans sitting there after church, sitting in like armchairs, smoking in silence, because he writes they recognized each other from the Eastern Front. And I mean, I got this in like late June, and when the day after I started reading it, I couldn't stop it. It was, I mean, it's like 7 or 8 pages, typewriter written, but I couldn't stop reading. So I don't know if whatever is in there is true, as in like factual. There's like long quotes where they talk about, the situation somewhere in, they write Russia, and it's like lots of heavy fighting, lots of losses, and to set the scene, they have like church service on the front line. And the first time these two gentlemen encountered or saw each other in Russia, whatever that means, I'm thinking like Belarus, whatever, that kind of like 43, 44. It's not in his diary from 1943, so I'm assuming it's 44. Where he writes like there's mass, and the narrator in this short story says to this major, "I'm going, are you coming?" And the major replies something like, "I can't, I've seen too much." So they talk about Russia, they talk about military service, and then the end of the story is like, so why do you go to church now 20 years later? It's like, and the quote unquote the morality would be like something like it's not impossible to find faith later in life. I don't know if this is to atone, to find solace, I don't know. But it's like, it is harrowing. And it's like, I do have a bunch of picture postcards written by soldiers during World War II. I have a bunch of picture postcards from civilians who were later ethnically cleansed. And I don't know yet what to do with it, because I would honestly like to find a publisher who would publish, like the original and the translation of, those prose and poetry writings. I don't know if I can talk any publisher into it. But it's like, so these are like those fragments where I'm now, that I'm tenured faculty, can do basically whatever I want. Shout out to my university. I have a ridiculously low teaching load, so I get to follow whatever I want to do here, which is also one of the supreme perks of academia. You'd have to say that. But being what it is, and I don't mean to talk anyone here personally, but not everyone, given the perks of such a position, actually likes to go on producing books or following their curiosity.
Yeah, they get complacent.
Yeah, and
you can almost definitely find a publisher in the United States or Canada for that. It might be more of a sensitive subject in Europe if that's one of the issues. But I think in Canada or the US they would be more.
I'm thinking about it in terms of, I don't mean to glorify any of it, because if just last week I found a German language podcast on Spotify by chance. It's called Kriegstagebücher in German, which is, for those who don't understand the word that I just said, it's one of those supremely long German combined nouns.
I recognize the word war, though.
Yeah, it's war diaries.
Got it. Okay.
And it's like, when I walk like from my office to my apartment, it's like 45 minutes walk. I can't stop listening. It's like, regular soldiers who wrote. I mean, I started because there was this one soldier's diary, which was also from Army Group Center in 44, which is where my grandfather was. So I'm kind of like trying to piece this together. But why do I tell you this? The reason for this is like, I'm technically an early modernist. So technically, as I told you in the beginning of our conversation, I wrote a book about the 16th century. Now I wrote one about the 17th century. I just submitted one to another publisher about the 18th and 19th century. And how do I end up now with the 20th century history? Something that I'm
just going chronologically. Sin in history at this point.
No, but it's also like, there is the opportunity to do something with this.
I think there's a lot of opportunity, almost too much that you have to narrow it down.
Since I'm like, tenured faculty and I have a very secure job, I can now do this without fearing for my career, because believe it or not, if you are a graduate student listening to this by chance, they're like, oh, this is such a cool topic. Would you mind sharing? I'm happy. If you want to help me digitize and categorize everything, fine with me. But the funny thing is, if you write a PhD about the 20th century, specifically if it has anything to do with World War II, you already know what the conclusions are before you read the first line of any textbook that you will ever read about the topic. I'm not saying this because, revisionism, let's, tear down everything. But what at an ontological level, as in like, on an epistemological level, as in like, how do we know what we know? If I start with the conclusion and work backwards, that's even worse than like, moving chronologically for time. So now I can just follow my curiosity, follow, the evidence that is available, and come up with conclusions.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one of the core problems. If you have 2 more minutes, I'll talk a colleague, by the way.
Keep going. Yeah.
There is this, most academics in the US and the humanities and the social sciences, is very pronounced, are of a certain ideological, let's say, predisposition that is, let's say, left of center.
Yes. Yes, I'm well aware.
You have probably noticed one or two things about that. I'll be perfectly honest about this. I don't share that sentiment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
For a variety of reasons. Some are personal, some are, like academically explainable, as in like I do consider socialism a kind of occult death thing.
Yes, and you will find with my listeners, I'm rooted in politically in this might not make as much sense to you as a European, but are you familiar with libertarianism?
Yes.
Right, and specifically the Mises Caucus, which is from Ron Paul. Do you know who Ron Paul is?
Yes, I do. I'm a huge fan.
Oh, fantastic! Yeah, so that's like I don't talk about politics too much I mean, politics comes into history and anthropology, of course, but that is where I'm at, and where traditionally a lot of my listeners and watchers are, but not always. But definitely right wing libertarianism is.
Yeah, I mean,
I go beyond that, but yeah,
I would say like, some of the things that I've never really understood about the US have become much more clear in the last 4 or 5 years of this COVID.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, I'll say this out loud because I think your listeners and viewers will appreciate this. Me as a Central European, very orderly German-speaking Central European, coming out strongly in favor of like own your own land, grow your own food, have a gun, and don't let anyone tell you anything else. Because this is, I think, the core lesson if you think about the COVID years in terms of like the stuff that went down. I mean, it's of course related to this. Norway was not as bad as other places in terms of like mandates, but the thing about
I could
Norway,
not believe what happened in Australia. I was just talking about that last night. Insane.
Yeah, it's utter insanity coupled with like what I call anticipatory obedience. You didn't even really need to go like full, totalitarianism as in like have laws about it, because you could rely on a bunch of people, do a sizable segment of the population who would, do any of this without regard to like being required to do so.
Right.
Like
decentralized social control is somehow more scary than
yeah. Because nobody is like responsible for anything, and everybody can like say like, look, there was never anything on the books. If you showed your ID for entering a shop, you're an idiot.
Mm-hmm.
But having that in mind, the weirdest thing about it is like, so Norway was way less, stringent with the mandates, at least in the part where I live. But it's like, if I think about it in terms of like, my elder daughter started school here in Norway. There were no mask mandates. There were no testing requirements, no nothing.
Mm.
And I'm supremely grateful to the local school board who said like, we don't do this kind of.
Wow.
If I compare this to like my nephews who are the same age in Austria. Oh, sorry, I have like a light problem here.
That's
because
right.
I just need to move, then the switch is on again. It's like new public management. So if you don't move,
we had that at my university as well. I would be sitting in my office and everything would just go dark. Yeah.
No, and the thing is to just wrap up this thought in terms of like, my nephews in Austria, they would be tested 3 times a week with toxic substances. There was no medical professional there. They would be bullied if they would refuse. There is like, I can't remember how often my brother told me about like the kids being quarantined because somebody else in the class had like contact with somebody who tested positive. Don't ask me. I mean, we could go down that particular rabbit hole forever, but in terms of like what I find so striking about it, to return to the previous topic, but I think it connects to this. It's like you can't have a conversation about a topic if you start with the conclusion, work backwards.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, if anyone wants to do a PhD, the only two things I mention is think about it as a long-term committed relationship. There will be good times, there will be bad times, and it will take for years to kind of like figure out how that thing, in that case, the PhD thing, actually works. You don't know this at the beginning, so this is the one thing, but you gotta be interested in this in terms of like, it's almost like being in a relationship.
Mm-hmm.
And, I mean, getting the title, sure, I have a ton of those bloody titles, so I can, of course, easily say, come on, it's not as important. It's a little bit like, waiting to get your driver's license. Once you have it, it's no longer that important, right?
Yeah.
But in terms of like, in the US, the system is much more, let's say, welcoming to people who say like, look, I got an undergraduate degree, I want to go back a couple of years later.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So it's much more welcoming. The European system is so different from this, because basically after you get your high school diploma equivalent at age 18, you have to decide, what do I want to do? In the US, if you want to do, say, like anthropology or history or classics as a PhD, you would have to do like social sciences as an undergrad. Over here, if you want to do a history major, you would do undergraduate study curriculum in history, you would do a master's degree in history, and you would do a PhD program in history. There's like nothing you do sideways.
Really? Oh, I wasn't aware of that. That's very interesting.
It's one of these things where
it's
I think...
also detrimental, I think, to, everybody's working then within the exact same field
Exactly.
trajectory. There's a loss of diversity of thought based on how those fields function.
Yeah, also, I think it's a supremely idea to come up with like asking 18-year-olds to decide what they would like to do,
Yeah.
for the rest of their lives. Professionally
for
speaking.
us, it's generally like, if you can kind of get your undergrad in whatever, if to go later, like there might be, there's never as far as I know, there's never a degree requirement. There might be some sort of course requirement for certain things. Like if you, like a lot of MDs, they get biology, but there's usually just courses you have to take, which makes sense to get a biology degree, but you don't have to.
Yeah, and the other thing that comes together there is like, I have a very nice colleague over here who is originally trained at the graduate level as as I think it's law. So she's like, I'm very, uncomfortably sitting between a lot of those traditions here.
Mm-hmm.
Where they're like, oh, so you studied law, why would you do a PhD in the humanities? So you should apply, within your field, don't come into mine.
I would never even think that that's odd in America. That would be very normal.
No, I share that sentiment.
Wow.
And this is so odd, because if you think about it in terms of like, if you don't do so this is the one oddity here in European academia. The other one is you have to stay not only in line in your field, but you can't have like, gaps in your CV. So if you don't get a postdoc position, post PhD within like your field and specialty, you can kind of like forget it.
That's so strange.
No,
it's not like that at all in America.
I know.
Canada.
I'm a huge fan. I mean, the American elite system that I am more familiar with than like everything else is like, it's far from perfect, but it's way more, like you can kind of like, do other things like work in government, in private sector, do whatever. If you have a good idea and pitch it in the right way, you can, like 10 years after your undergraduate degree, you can get a scholarship at Harvard.
Yeah. It's actually a lot of post-bachelor's studies. It's a lot of times they actually encourage you to have other experience. A lot of them, they don't want you to apply. Like I was looking at MBA programs for a time, and a lot of those programs, the average age of the student is 29 or 30, and they consider for your cohort what you've done besides that. That's very strange.
And it's even worse if you consider the fact that, in my career, what I did is almost like too heretical to have, led to success as in like tenured faculty status that I now have. in terms of like, I changed from one university to the other because I had disagreements with my first PhD supervisor, which is typically a death sentence for any academic career in European academia. Probably also in the US, but perhaps
that in the
to a
US
lesser
that's
degree.
the same. Yeah.
Because I mean, my first PhD supervisor who invited me to, do you want to write a PhD? I'm like, yeah, sure. I wanted to do that. So this is like 2006, 7. And then I figured out like, oh, that's not kind of working out. What I'm going to do with my life now. So I took a year out of my PhD curriculum, applied for an internship with the Austrian Foreign Ministry. I spent a year working national security issues, which I found hilarious because I told you what I did for my PhD, which is like reading Latin contracts from the 16th century.
Yeah.
For whatever reason, they put me in the national security division, which I learned a lot about this. I mean, a lot of it is banal to a degree that, of course, is commensurate with Austria being a small, technically neutral country in the European Union, so it's not very important. But what I did for a living for like a year was things that I didn't know about the European Union, by the way, which is another rabbit hole. But what I didn't know is that the European Union is technically a kind of like nascent federalized superstructure. And what I didn't know, so what I did, so there's 2 ambassadors at the EU per member state. One is the official guy who goes around shaking hands, goes to dinners and dining parties, what have you. And the other one is the one who sits in what's called the Political and Security Committee, PSC, which is the EU's equivalent of the National Security Council. It is ambassador level. It convenes like 2 to 3 times per week or more often, if necessary. And I was the guy in the Austrian Foreign Ministry who wrote like the bullet points, minutes, and everything else that went directly to those meetings every week.
Okay.
So I'm just mentioning this because this is so funny because it also tells you about the differences of academic cultures. So this is what I did for a year. It was very interesting, but about like half a year later, I'm like, yeah, I should probably think about getting an additional postgraduate diploma because otherwise I can't join the diplomatic service. Because I'm just a historian, So I applied. I could have gone to Johns Hopkins University to some other fancy name places there too. But then I decided I kind of like want to finish my PhD first. And so this is 2008-9. And if you care to remember, 2008 summer is when I was there, when the Russian troops marched into Georgia in mid-August.
Yeah, I remember that.
So you have to imagine
watching the tanks on the television.
Yeah. So just to be perfectly clear, the European Parliament has commissioned a report, which is online. It's in 2009. It was written. It established that the Georgians opened fire and the Russians responded.
Is that what happened?
That is what the Western, elites say what happened. Okay. The trick there, however, is, and this is what it connects to, like Ukraine, in ways that are very uncomfortable for both the Russians and the West, I would argue. The trick is there is a sizable contingent of Russian speakers in Georgia as well as in eastern Ukraine.
Right.
So the Georgians, egged on by the West, that a couple of months earlier at the Bucharest summit said, like, Ukraine and Georgia will join NATO. This is George W. Bush just before he leaves office. Kind of like pours money into the Georgian military. They did the same in Ukraine, by the way. And said, like, you gotta get rid of, like, the Russian peacekeepers in the area. So this is why the Georgians opened fire, and which is why the Russians rolled into Georgia. So yes, the Georgians shot first, but they were stupid to do so because they may have believed that the Americans would start bombing Russia. We are almost there right now, by the way, in this utterly insane situation. But it also goes back to the anthropological side of this. Why on God's green earth would we consider the language people speak the only thing that is both unchangeable and the only thing that defines your identity? Because last time, talking gender absurdities here for a second, last time I thought this is all a social construct and you can change it multiple times per day or something without, coming across as some weirdo who has lost his marbles. But somehow language is the only thing that matters, and it matters enduringly, and you can't change it. So, personally, we have a bunch of Ukrainian refugees in the village, in the small town where I live. All of them speak Russian, but all of them say I'm Ukrainian. So riddle me that. It's like, can't just, say, oh, they speak Russian, so this is why we are permitted to just waltz into the neighboring countries. Don't get me wrong about these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But the reason why I mentioned this is you have to imagine Putin was with the Chinese president at the opening of the Olympics in Beijing. It's Friday afternoon. This is mid-August 2008. The only two people in the National Security Division on this afternoon who are still at the foreign ministry in Vienna at this point is me, the intern, and the deputy section head.
Mm-hmm.
I have honestly never seen diplomats, run across, corridors. It is a sight to behold, that I can tell you for sure.
I'm sure they're all very athletic.
Extremely so, but they're running around like headless chicken.
Mm-hmm.
Because, and the larger historical importance there isn't whether or not Putin is a bad guy or whether the Georgian president has lost his marbles or what have you.
Mm-hmm.
But the larger implication is this is mid-August. If you ever want to, this is the part where I understood World War I. Everybody is on vacation in August in Brussels and in Washington.
Yes.
You have to give it to Putin. He knew that, and he was very cunningly using this to his advantage, because he knew if he starts, this attack in rolling tanks into Georgia proper on a Friday afternoon when every Westerner would be glued to their television screens watching the Beijing Olympics, marveling in best Kremlinology and Sovietology manner. Oh, this is Putin. Did he just blink at Xi Jinping? What would that mean? In the meantime, nobody watches what happens in Georgia.
Right.
Half of NATO, half of the EU, half of Washington, D.C. is on vacation in mid-August.
Yeah. They're all in Hawaii. They're not dealing with Russian
If you go back
tanks.
to 1914, how do you think this crisis kind of like spiraled completely out of control? Because it was holiday season.
Wow, I didn't know that.
But you see, this is where I said, like, the reason why I'm telling you this is, like, to understand what matters in American academia is when I'm, at the opening, open bar thingy at Columbia in September 2018. I'm introduced as the visiting professor so-and-so, and apart from his scholarly things, he also worked as a year in the foreign ministry. This is what matters, because this is exactly what you meant, what you mentioned like a moment ago, as in like they are a little bit more interested in what else you did, because everybody comes with like scholarly accolades, blah blah blah.
Ah, yes. So they were more interested in America.
Yeah,
is what you're saying.
Yeah, this is what they were interested in. Of course, I mean the Harriman Institute, which is this kind of like Eastern European, one of the three premier Eastern European research clusters. It's interdisciplinary. There's political scientists, Russian studies people, blah, 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 all of that. And it's a little bit like research plus think tank thingy.
Mm-hmm.
And for them, this is a relevant thing. Over here, this is never mentioned. Nobody gets, nobody cares about it. I mean, I don't care that they don't care. So they care like, oh, where did you get your PhD? Where did you do your studies? Blah, blah, blah. So it's another manifestation of those like differences in culture, I think.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I had no idea of that difference in academia. I know of differences between, of course, North American and European academia, but I didn't realize that one. That whole thing seems very detrimental to me. I think in general there's lots of this is so broad, but I think that Europe versus North America, the U.S. and Canada, it's more like stringent. It's more in Europe. It pretty much everything is more. There's less. Everything is more like single track rather than in the U.S. and Canada, where I think it results from almost a frontier spirit that we still have the remnants of in the U.S. and Canada from expansion, which has obviously been mostly closed for a long time. But I think that obviously it's different in different places. And what you were talking about before in Norway, right? Norway being a country that is in NATO, of course, but not in the EU. But also more rural than a lot of other places. And specifically, like if you're going to compare it to the rest of Scandinavia rather than Europe broadly, Denmark and Sweden are less rural, and they also have distinct politics from Norway in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And my COVID, like I'm from Connecticut, southern New England, which is very like we have the roots. The first European settlers in New England were Puritans, and that culture continues. That's the root of our culture. And there's a book, American Nations. I think Colin Woodard. It's one of my favorites, but it talks about um, the cultural foundation in different nations. Nations not meaning state, but nations meaning like culture and the underlying beliefs interstate. So in the United States and Canada and into Mexico as well, there's these nations that he identified. Yankeedom being the one that's in New England, which stretches into it's New England and it stretches into Newfoundland and Canada as well, but it also stretches into upstate New York and parts of the Midwest that were settled by New England settlers, mostly Ohio. Anecdote: Connecticut, my state, actually used to own parts of Ohio, which is a state that's very far away. But our COVID policies were actually more in a lot of the United States, especially the South and the Midwest. Our COVID policies were more stringent than the ones that you described in Norway. I was actually student teaching at the time, and it was part of the reason why I quit was because of how part of my experience with those COVID policies. Yeah, I kind of talked myself into a hole there, but there's something interesting there, and the difference between Europe and America, but also differences between locales in Europe and in America. So, do you have anything else?
I mean, in terms of like the rural-urban divide, I would simply, I mean, because we're close to 3 hours now.
Yeah.
I would just merely footnote it in terms of like the three Scandinavian countries are they're very much alike. I jokingly typically say like, think about the Western Balkans minus the self-awareness. In terms of like Eastern Europeans, it's like they're cousins. And
yeah,
they
and
mock
also the
each other.
Kalmar Union. I mean, they used to be one place, really.
Yeah, but I mean, Denmark is extremely highly, centralized. It's probably
Right.
Europe's last surviving absolutist monarchy.
Yeah.
It's highly focused on like Copenhagen.
Hmm.
Sweden is like the industrial powerhouse.
Hmm.
So also the industrial and labor structure is very different. And Norway is, I mean, this might amuse you because they ran it like in like a year ago without any kind of like irony and or self-awareness. The state broadcaster said like technically when like the climate summit was meeting in like some Emirates, some Doha, Dubai, what have you, they would go like, you know what, we're also like a small country with lots of oil and gas. We're kind of like an emirate. And I'm like, exactly. So the thing to understand
and a
about
monarchy. Yeah.
and the thing to understand there, this is why I say this to wrap this up in a way, is like, so the solution in Norway to solving societal problems is like taking money from the oil and gas fund and throwing it at things, hoping that something works, or at least that people don't, become uppity. And this has worked for Norway for decades, but it
And they
also
have a large
means that
sovereign fund, right? And they're
but it also
yeah.
means that the population kind of like everybody needs to be nice to each other, which is nice. So high trust culture, which is
Hmm.
very nice to see and to
Very
live
nice.
in.
Yeah.
I mean, I live in a small town, so like 2,200 people. So I like that because my kids can go to school, they can visit their friends. It's very safe, etc. Even though
Hmm.
the immigrant population, myself of course included, would be somewhere around 30%. So just
Hmm.
just to give you the basics there. But the thing is, it's relatively safe. Most of the crime comes from Sweden because it's like imported Middle Eastern clans that are now expanding into Norway.
Mm.
A lot of the crime is like this. It's a little bit like in
Oh.
the US with like what comes into like the what's it called, the cartels. taking over parts. So basically, I mean, like, take a couple of notches down, so no mass shootings and things like this so far, so knock on wood. But the thing is, Norway just subsidizes everything. It's excessively overregulated.
I'm sure it is.
And I mean, if you go through like expat groups on like Facebook or some other social media things, you can easily see, like, especially Brits and Americans, like, you know, they're like 5 people pretending to do the job that one could be doing. But but this is like, you know, I mean, if you have kids, it's perfect because the workday typically stops at 4 p.m. And it's impolite to do something afterwards, work related.
Wow.
So if you have small
very
kids,
different.
it's a very nice place to be.
Yeah, I'm sure it is.
And no, it's a very lovely country. And to kind of like go back to our introductory bits and pieces, if you're ever in the area, let me know.
I will. Yeah. Okay. So I think we're good here. This was a great conversation. Covered a lot of things. But one thing I'd like to bring up as a possibility, if you're interested, about those postcards, if you'd ever like to do a kind of sharing of some of these postcards, we could do a live stream on my channel if you wanted to select some of them. I'm sure people would be interested, if that's something you'd like to do.
Sure, of course. I mean, I would go for like a box full of like US picture postcards. I mean, most of them are from like New York and like major tourist destinations in California. But I mean, I put this up on the Substack. There's even like a couple of ones from like Clinton, Wisconsin, population like 1,100 or something in the 1950s. Wow. So if you're imagining small town America in the 50s.
Yeah. So by the way, my audience is extremely diverse, in everything, but, only about 50-60% of my audience is actually American. It's very,
that's cool.
It's very broad. I have, like, I when I do live streams, I ask people where they're from, and, I got Turks and, lots of Brits, a heavily disproportionate amount of Australians. I don't know why, but a lot of Australians versus the population. I have more Australians than Canadians, which pisses me off. I feel like I'm not being supported by our northern brothers here, but yeah.
But we could certainly do this, especially since I mean, this is also in the like 80% of the picture postcards are from like Austria, so this is like super special. But the other 20% is like literally from all over the place. So this is also what I typically put out on the Substack, because I know people are interested, probably not so much in, you know, village 1, 2, 3, 5, 5, 6 from Lower Austria, which I went to as a kid, which is why I find this so awesome. But it's also like, so I've done something, you know, sometimes I just bump into people. So for instance, I have like a colleague who's originally from Kenya. So when I talked to him, I was like, oh, by the way, I looked up, you know, the Kenya picture postcards here. I'll send you like the scanned ones. So I mean, if you look like after countries, so if you add like countries, like, so I've put up stuff from like Latin America, from like Bolivia, from like Paraguay, I think. No, Bolivia, Paraguay. I've put up like Cuba before the revolution and thereafter.
Yes.
Like Nepal, Sri Lanka. There's tons of images from like Australia. And
I'd love to get like a broad swath of both time and place. If you'd be interested in sharing some of those on a live stream, and we could talk about them. Yeah, people would love that. I'm sure they would.
I'd love to do it. I mean, I'm getting to know so many places that I will never go to. And I'm like, it's so interesting to go there. Like, at least armchair travel wise. And the greatest thing about the picture postcards is on the one hand, it's like, you know, a lot of those things no longer exist, but it also gives you an impression. I mean, some of them are like, you know, sure, like main sites, famous buildings, statues, what have you. But there's also like a lot of them that just show street life in like the 60s and 70s.
Right.
Coolest thing about it, by the way, in my opinion, is like cars looked way better. I don't want to say anything about safety or driving them.
Right.
But
No, terrible.
I'm old enough
cooler.
to have learned driving with like manual transmission. So it's like,
I did as well, which is rare for my time and in America in general. But yeah, yeah, I'd love to get those. This is the same reason why I have so many old books. I mean, some of them are modern, but you can see behind me
Yeah,
just from the bindings that these are old. And they're like a time capsule of places, and often, things that don't exist anymore. I haven't gotten into reading it, but I have a book on Soviet archaeology, which I really want to go through.
that's cool.
Obviously the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. And it's as far as like, differences in what places are like, in different times, and political institutions that don't exist anymore, the same as geographic places that don't exist anymore, or at least in their current form.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that, including like, even a dictionary or something, how definitions change over time. Cultural Marxism loves to
Yeah.
erase etymology. All
Yeah, I
right.
mean, if you're talking about this, just one thing to add,
Yeah, please.
because it recently dawned on me when I was reading something on Norwegian media. There was otherwise a very uninteresting person who went on a family vacation to a museum in Berlin to get his iris scanned by Sam Altman, who founded it's called World Coin, if you can believe it.
Sam Altman from
Yes,
yeah.
ChatGPT person. It's a venture capital driven thing, and this moron went to Berlin, got his biometric data scanned, and
I
now
wouldn't
he
give that
says
dude
like,
my spit.
no, not anything. But the thing is, the reason why this person did it is because he wanted this human creation to verify that he's a human. And if because you just mentioned like, this is cultural Marxism, but this is why I mentioned I consider that kind of thing as like an occult death cult thingy, for the
Yeah.
reason for one primary reason, and I'm saying this not because I want to proselytize or anything, but if you go back to Exodus and to Genesis specifically, we are created, says the Bible, in His image. And if you consider what has happened by this stupid person needing a human thing to verify his humanity, this is, doing in eschatological terms, this is like you're doing Satan's work, because you don't need to prove if you believe in the Bible, if you take this for the sake of the argument literally, what you're doing is like, you don't need to prove anything, because you are created in His image. There's no proof needed.
Right.
But if you
I
now
can't even
go,
wrap my head around needing proof of that.
no,
But
I mean,
sorry, continue.
I also do like my slightly tinfoil hat thing, Substack writing. I'll send you the translated version of this if you're interested in this, because it's too absurd. Because if you go to Wikipedia, to the bigger point, forget about the Bible, footnoting thing. But if you go to Wikipedia and enter mankind, it directs you to humanity.
Of course it
And
does.
mankind, of course, has additional implications, isn't it?
Right.
And it will also point you to, like, if you click on the disambiguation page, it will give you everything but the eschatological meaning. So they play their word games.
Yes.
And what they want to do is they want to use human creations to make you verify that say that you are human, which is insane.
Yeah.
And which is also
it's insane.
demonic, if you ask me. So
I would agree. Yeah. Jeez.
it's just like, no, it's I'll send you this because I have my own little Substack there where I translate stuff from Norwegian and German media into English so people can read it. It's all for free. It's like I do this in my spare time. But I'll send this particular one to you because it's just too insane to believe.
Yeah. And I'd love to see that. I'm gonna send you I'll send you a message on Twitter. I want to get the links that you want to share on the description. This episode won't be out for probably 2 to 3 weeks, but I'm gonna put it on my Patreon like now. So, I'll probably download the episode and put it on the Patreon. And then it'll be out in edited form in 2 to 3 weeks. But I'll get your links so I can share them even with the Patreon I usually do it like the things that you most want to share, right? Because if you share I recommend 1 to 2 and 3 at most, but if you
Yeah.
it's usually the thing that you want to share most, because people aren't gonna, if you share too many things like, hey, check out these 5 things, people won't choose any of them.
No, no, I'll send you 2 links. That's
Okay,
perfectly
that's
fine
perfect.
because people can take it from there. I mean, I have a faculty profile, so I'm easily findable.
Mm-hmm.
If you would like to find me, look up, my scholarship, etc. But I'll send you the 2 Substack links, which is probably the easiest way to find me, both for my angry libertarian-esque writings about socialists in the EU taking over everything.
It's fantastic that I just end up with people like this. Like, maybe it's
And
probably just comes from my Twitter audience, but yeah.
well, I'm not sharing my Twitter feed now, but it could be.
That's all right. Yeah.
No, but in terms of like this and the postcards, I mean, this is probably the most
Mm-hmm.
interesting stuff, that most easily digestible as well.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Just send me those links and I'll put them up. It was so nice to meet you and talk to you, and we'll talk again
Likewise.
about that live stream with the postcards. I think that would be something people would really, really like.
Before we do that, I'll send you some of the postcards that I have already scanned, so you can take a look at them.
Awesome. I'll send you my email in a in a Twitter message. All right. Thank you
I think
so
you
much.
already did, so thank you very much for your
I
time.
did.
Greatly
Yeah.
appreciate it.
Oh, thank you for your time. This is terrific. All right.
And see you soon.